I lay trapped in the sterile hospital bed, my body broken and wrapped in heavy bandages, while my husband tightly held his mistress's hand right in front of me. He looked down at my shattered form and called me a worthless burden. He proudly announced that he had sold our house. What he did not know, however, was that mere hours before the catastrophic car crash, I had signed legal documents to inherit a staggering $48 million fortune. When his glamorous new partner walked into the room to mock my misery, she took one look at my face and let out a piercing scream. But it wasn't for the reason you might assume. My name is Arya, and at 33 years old, I honestly believed I understood the true depth of human suffering. I was profoundly wrong. As a passionately dedicated archivist specializing in rare antiques, I had dedicated my entire existence to preserving the past. Yet I never could have anticipated that my own future would be violently shattered in a fraction of a second. I lay paralyzed in that blindingly white ICU room, listening to the monotonous, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, the only tangible proof that my heart was still beating. My body felt impossibly heavy, as though my veins were pumping liquid lead, and a blinding, searing pain radiated from my crushed legs straight up into my spine. I desperately attempted to shift my weight, but the lower half of my body completely refused to obey my commands. A suffocating panic began to claw at my chest, tightening my throat until I could barely breathe. Flashes of memory hit me. The slick, rain-washed asphalt, the blinding, terrifying headlights of the massive truck that swerved violently into my lane, and the overwhelming, euphoric joy I had been feeling just moments prior to the brutal impact. I had been rushing home to tell Garrett, my husband of 5 long years, that our miserable financial struggles were officially over. I wanted to tell him that the grumpy, elderly man I had cared for, Silas Sterling, had left me his entire empire. But now, as I blinked against the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights, the grim reality of my current nightmare crashed down upon me with the weight of an ocean. Before I delve deeper into this tale of betrayal, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to meticulously rebuild your entire life from the ashes after someone you loved took everything from you. This journey is not merely about cold revenge. It is about discovering a dormant, terrifying strength we never knew resided within us. A nurse finally strolled in, but her expression was devoid of any human compassion. She carelessly flipped through a metal clipboard at the foot of my bed, not even bothering to make eye contact. "You are finally awake," she muttered, her tone flat, robotic, and strictly professional. "We need to discuss your immediate discharge plan because your health insurance provider has officially flagged and halted your coverage." I desperately tried to speak, to beg for information about my husband, but my vocal cords produced nothing more than a dry, raspy wheeze. "Where is Garrett?" The nurse let out a heavy sigh, acting as though my very existence was a massive inconvenience to her shift. "Mr. Vance was actually here while you were unconscious in the coma. He took care of the consent forms for your emergency treatment." A massive wave of profound relief washed over my aching chest. Garrett had been here. He had stepped up and taken care of me. But then, the nurse delivered a devastating blow that entirely shattered my fragile hope. "He explicitly declined the reconstructive surgery required for your crushed legs. He claimed the procedure was far too expensive and that the rehabilitation time would be a burden. Instead, he authorized the cheapest standard casting method available. It saved him roughly $40,000 up front. But I have to be completely honest with you, Mrs. Vance. Without that specific reconstructive surgery, your chances of ever walking normally again are hovering at less than 10%. You will almost certainly require a cane or be bound to a wheelchair for the remainder of your natural life." I stared at her, my vision blurring as the sterile room began to violently spin around me. Garrett, the same man who routinely dropped thousands of dollars on elite golf club memberships and custom-tailored Italian suits, had coldly calculated that my basic ability to walk was simply not worth the financial investment. He actively chose to leave me permanently disabled just to save some cash. My brain completely short-circuited trying to process this horrific betrayal. How could the man who stood at an altar and vowed to protect me in sickness and in health sign a piece of paper condemning me to a lifetime of crippling immobility? The physical agony in my shattered legs was excruciating, but the agonizing betrayal tearing through my heart was infinitely worse. In that sterile row, I realized I wasn't a beloved wife to him. I was simply a defective line item in a financial budget he was eager to trim. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor rapidly accelerated, matching the furious, pounding rhythm of my breaking heart. He didn't know about the millions. He had absolutely no idea that I could have paid for that $40,000 surgery 50 times over with pocket change. And now, he was going to pay his own unimaginable price. Suddenly, the door to my hospital room didn't just casually open. It was violently thrown open with a massive force that made the aluminum frame rattle loudly. I instinctively flinched, bracing for a doctor rushing in with fatal news. Instead, the immaculate, sharp silhouette of my husband, Garrett, materialized in the doorway. He was dressed in his premium charcoal gray Italian suit, the specific one he strictly reserved for closing million-dollar commercial real estate deals. His hair was perfectly sculpted, smelling of expensive designer cologne mixed with the fresh ozone of the pouring rain outside. There were no apology flowers in his manicured hands. There was absolutely no look of relief or love in his eyes. Instead, he gripped a thick, crumpled manila envelope as if it were a loaded weapon. He marched aggressively to the side of my bed, not to comfort me, but to inspect me as though I were a severely damaged piece of depreciating property. "Finally awake, are you?" He sneered, his voice completely devoid of any recognizable warmth. "It's about time. Do you possess even the slightest idea how much this dramatic little nap of yours is currently costing me by the hour?" Before I could even manage to whisper his name or beg for a sip of water, he aggressively hurled the heavy envelope directly onto my chest. The sharp corners of the stiff paper dug painfully into my bruised collarbone, but that brief physical sting was absolutely nothing compared to the sickening shock of his unprovoked hostility. I looked down through tear-blurred vision. It wasn't a sweet, get-well-soon card. It was a preliminary, itemized billing statement from the hospital's financial department. The total numbers printed at the bottom were staggering. "Garrett, what is this?" I managed to croak out, my damaged throat feeling like dry sandpaper. "This is the hefty bill for your absolute incompetence, Arya," he spat, leaning his weight over the metal bed rail until his furious face was merely inches from mine. "You took the luxury Porsche without asking my permission." My Porsche, the exact one I just finished paying off with my own salary, and you recklessly wrapped it around a steel guardrail. Do you even comprehend that the vehicle is a total, unsalvageable loss? I had to stand out there in the freezing rain, staring at the twisted, smoking metal while the emergency crew cut your bleeding body out, and all I could possibly think about was the massive hit to the car's depreciation value. I weakly attempted to defend myself, tears spilling hot down my cheeks. It was pouring rain, Garrett. A massive commercial truck violently swerved into my lane. I had absolutely no choice. He threw his head back and laughed, a sharp, cruel, barking sound that echoed terrifyingly in the small room. "Save your pathetic sob story for someone who actually cares. The insurance adjuster certainly does not care. In fact, they aren't paying a single dime for this mess." I felt the blood freeze in my veins. "What do you mean they aren't paying? We have premium full coverage." Garrett casually checked his luxury watch, looking utterly bored, as if this life-altering conversation was keeping him from a more important meeting. "They aren't paying out because I proactively told the local police the actual truth, Arya. I informed them that you have been acting highly erratic lately. I told them I heavily suspected you were actively abusing prescription painkillers again just to cope with your miserable, boring little archival job." My jaw physically dropped. I had never touched an illegal or unprescribed narcotic in my entire 33 years of life until this devastating crash. "You lied to the police," I whispered, horrified. "You intentionally framed your own wife just to save your annual insurance rates." He nonchalantly shrugged, adjusting his silk tie in the reflection of the window. "I did exactly what I had to do to permanently protect my own financial standing." If the authorities believe this was an isolated substance abuse issue, the entire financial burden falls directly on you, not my pristine policy record. You are completely on your own with these astronomical medical bills. And looking at that final total, I sincerely hope you have a secret stash of cash hidden inside those dusty, moldy antique books of yours, because I am absolutely not ruining my flawless credit score to fix your reckless mistakes. I stared at the man I had slept beside for 5 long years. I didn't see my husband anymore. I saw a dangerous, calculating stranger who had just viciously kicked me while my spine was broken. He didn't know that the secret stash he was mocking was actually $48 million of liquid capital, sitting safely in a private trust fund I had legally secured just hours before the truck hit me. And he had no idea that his calculated cruelty had just permanently sealed his own miserable fate. Garrett aggressively reached into his inner suit jacket pocket once more. I mistakenly assumed he was finished verbally abusing me, but he was merely warming up. He yanked out a thick, legally folded document and dropped it heavily onto the hospital bed sheets, right next to my paralyzed, cast-covered legs. The sheer weight of the heavy paper felt like a massive boulder crushing the very last ounce of hope I had clinging to my soul. I slowly picked it up, my bruised hands trembling uncontrollably, not from the chill of the room, but from pure, unadulterated shock. The bold, black words printed at the top were final and legally binding: petition for dissolution of marriage. I looked up at him, my breath painfully catching in my damaged lungs. "You are divorcing me. I am literally lying in a hospital bed, permanently broken because of a horrific accident, and you are actively serving me divorce papers." Garrett let out an exasperated sigh, casually adjusting his expensive silver cufflinks as if this was just another tedious corporate transaction taking up too much of his valuable time. "Do not make this significantly harder than it needs to be, Arya. Be rational for once. Take a realistic look at yourself. You are officially damaged goods now. My real estate career is currently skyrocketing. I am regularly closing massive deals with international foreign investors and high-net-worth individuals. I require a stunning wife who can confidently stand by my side at elite black-tie galas, a woman who can effortlessly charm rich clients on the country club tennis court, someone who flawlessly looks the part of a wealthy power couple. I absolutely do not need a crippled wife who requires a metal handicap ramp everywhere she travels. I do not need a broken partner who constantly smells like cheap antiseptic and pathetic pity. It is entirely about optics, Arya. You are a heavy iron anchor dragging me straight to the bottom of the ocean, and I desperately need to fly." The sheer, calculated cruelty of his terrible words sliced significantly deeper than the shattered glass from the windshield ever had. He was casually discarding me exactly like one of the broken, dusty antiques I used to meticulously restore for a living. Only, he saw absolutely no hidden value in my broken pieces. "But we have been completely devoted to each other for 5 years," I whispered, hot tears freely streaming down my bruised face. "I financially supported you when you were an absolute nobody. I paid our entire rent when you were struggling to study for your real estate license. I bought you your very first tailored suit. Doesn't any of that loyalty mean anything to you?" He chuckled darkly, shaking his head with a look of genuine, sickening amusement plastered across his handsome face. "That was merely an early investment, Arya. And now, I am proactively liquidating my faulty assets to rapidly cut my financial losses. Oh, and speaking of financial assets, do not even bother checking our joint savings account. I fully moved all the funds yesterday afternoon while you were bleeding out in emergency surgery. All $200,000 of it. I legally transferred it to an anonymous offshore account for a highly lucrative, high-risk investment opportunity down in the Cayman Islands. Technically, if that specific investment fails, the money is legally gone. And on paper, it has conveniently already failed as of this morning. So there is absolutely nothing left for you to claim in the divorce settlement. No legal judge in the country can award you half of zero." I stared at him in pure, unfiltered horror, my concussed mind entirely unable to fully comprehend the sociopathic level of his betrayal. "You stole our entire life savings. That money was supposed to be the down payment for a house. That was for our future children. We saved that money, dollar by painful dollar. There is absolutely no our future anymore," he stated coldly, leaning in so dangerously close that I could easily smell the fresh mint on his breath. "There is only my future now, and my future is incredibly expensive. I desperately need that capital to firmly secure my senior partnership in the new firm. You can keep your pathetic personal items and your little wrecked car, assuming the insurance company doesn't seize it first. But the bank accounts are completely empty. The credit cards are permanently canceled as of 8:00 a.m. this morning. You are completely on your own, Arya. Effective immediately, you are walking away from this marriage with exactly what you are inherently worth. Nothing. He vainly chi. Seeked his reflection in the darkened glass of the hospital room window, quickly fixing a stray strand of hair, ensuring his physical perfection remained entirely intact while my entire life lay in smoldering ruins. I deeply realized then that the sharply dressed man standing before me was not just a selfish jerk. He was a clinically calculated sociopath. He had been meticulously planning this exit strategy long before the truck ever hit me. The brutal accident simply handed him the perfect, convenient excuse to rapidly accelerate his cruel timeline. He systematically stripped me of my physical health, my marriage, and my total financial security in under 10 agonizing minutes. And he accomplished it all without blinking an eye. But as he arrogantly turned toward the door, casually checking his smartphone for a text message, I felt a massive psychological shift occur deep inside my soul. The crushing despair was rapidly being replaced by a freezing cold, diamond-hard resolve. He foolishly thought he had taken absolutely everything from me. He genuinely believed I was entirely helpless. He had absolutely no idea that while he was pathetically stealing $200,000, I had legally and secretly inherited a massive global empire worth $48 million. He was playing amateur checkers, while I was currently holding the master keys to the entire global chessboard. Just as Garrett finally turned to leave the room, the heavy door violently swung open once again, but this time the very atmosphere shifted. A thick, suffocating cloud of offensively expensive, cloying floral perfume instantly filled the sterile room, completely masking the harsh smell of medical antiseptic. Jessica boldly walked in. She looked exactly like she had just confidently stepped off a Paris runway, or rather, like someone who was desperately, pathetically trying to prove she belonged on one. She was adorned in a cream-colored, skin-tight Gucci dress that cost significantly more than my first vehicle, and her highlighted hair was professionally styled in loose, glossy waves that bounced dramatically with every arrogant step. She wasn't just here to emotionally support Garrett. She was here to aggressively mark her new territory. She didn't even bother to look at me at first. She was entirely focused on her own reflection in the darkened screen of her smartphone, carefully adjusting her bright red lipstick. Then, with a highly practiced, entirely artificial smile that didn't even come close to reaching her cold eyes, she enthusiastically hit the record button. "Hey guys, welcome back to this channel," she chirped loudly, her voice artificially pitching up a full octave into that incredibly fake, grating influencer tone. I know I usually post high-end unboxings or luxury travel vlogs, but today's video is a little bit different. Today is all about showing grace and compassion. She swiftly flipped the camera lens, and suddenly my severely bruised, swollen, and tear-stained face was being broadcasted onto her screen. I desperately tried to turn my head away, attempting to shield my remaining dignity with my hands, but my arms were far too weak, and the plastic IV lines pulled painfully tight against my bruised skin. Jessica didn't care about my pain. She purposely zoomed the camera in. "We are currently here at the city hospital visiting Garrett's tragic ex-wife. As you all know, my amazing fiancé Garrett is such an absolute saint, even though their marriage ended because... Well, we won't get into her toxic, messy details right now. He is still standing here, generously paying for her medical bills, making sure she is comfortable." She dramatically pouted her glossy lips, staring directly into the camera lens with entirely feigned, exaggerated sadness. "It is just so incredibly heartbreaking to see someone hit rock bottom like this. But we believe in good karma, don't we, guys? We strongly believe in helping those who are vastly less fortunate, even when they have been horribly bitter and jealous towards us." I felt a massive surge of nausea that had absolutely nothing to do with my traumatic brain injury. "Get that camera out of my face," I rasped, my damaged voice cracking painfully. "Jessica, please, have some basic human decency." She let out a light, tinkling laugh, a sound that was clearly meant to sound charming but physically felt like jagged shards of broken glass. "Oh, just listen to her," she loudly announced to her digital followers, not even bothering to look at me directly. "She is clearly a little delirious and confused from the heavy pain medication. Poor, pathetic thing. But seriously, guys, make sure to drop a heart emoji in the live chat if you think Garrett is the absolute best man ever for handling this chaotic mess." She finally lowered the phone slightly, but the red recording light didn't stop blinking. She leaned in uncomfortably close, her outrageously expensive leather handbag carelessly brushing against my freshly casted leg. "Take a good look at yourself, Arya," she whispered fiercely, her voice instantly dropping the sickly sweet act. "You look like literal roadkill. Garrett warned me you were pathetic, but this visual far exceeds my wildest expectations. You know, I almost feel a tiny bit bad for taking your beautiful house. Almost. But then I quickly remember exactly how good the massive master bedroom looks with all of my expensive things in it." She straightened her posture, arrogantly flipping her hair back over her shoulder, and turned her attention to Garrett. "Babe, did you tell her about the massive charity auction we are hosting next week? I was seriously thinking maybe we can set up a public GoFundMe page for her. It would be incredibly amazing PR for your real estate firm. We can title the campaign, Help the Helpless. It shows the public we are the bigger people, and honestly, the engagement metrics on my social profile would be totally insane." Garrett chuckled warmly, sliding his arm possessively around her tiny waist. "That is absolutely brilliant, Jess. That is exactly why I love you so much. You are always thinking about maximizing the brand." He looked back at me with cold, dead, shark-like eyes. "You really should be overwhelmingly grateful, Arya. Jessica is graciously willing to leverage her massive platform to get you some pathetic pity money. God knows you are desperately going to need every penny of it, since you are officially uninsurable now." I silently watched them, the perfect, beautiful, sociopathic couple, casually plotting to monetize my agonizing tragedy for internet likes. My hands tightly clenched into shaking fists at my sides. They genuinely thought they were actively burying me alive. They thought this hospital room was the pathetic end of my story. But as Jessica vainly preened for her camera, constantly checking her rising follower count, she didn't realize she was actively documenting legal evidence. Every single cruel word, every arrogant sneer, every blatant violation of my medical privacy was being permanently recorded. And while they gleefully saw a broken, defeated woman trapped in a hospital bed, I clearly saw the opening chapter of their total destruction. I didn't say another word. I just coldly stared at the glowing red recording dot on her phone and silently promised myself that one day I would own that phone, that brand, and absolutely everything they thought they had built. Jessica slowly lowered her phone, but her twisted show was far from over. She carelessly reached for the styrofoam cup of steaming hot tea the nurse had left on my bedside table hours earlier. I watched her perfectly manicured, acrylic fingers wrapped tightly around the cheap cup with a blatant look of aristocratic distaste. "Is this garbage yours?" she asked, examining the cup. Then, with a highly deliberate flick of her wrist that was far too precise to ever be considered an accident, the cup violently tipped forward. The scalding, boiling liquid aggressively splashed directly onto my exposed, bruised thigh just inches above where the heavy plaster cast began. The agonizing pain was instant and incredibly sharp, a searing, burning sensation that violently forced a strangled, guttural cry from my raw throat. I frantically tried to jerk my injured leg away instinctively, but the heavy metal traction device held me firmly in place, entirely trapping me in the horrific agony. The hot liquid rapidly soaked into the thin hospital sheets and pooled intensely against my raw skin, instantly turning it an angry, blistering red. Jessica did not gasp in shock. She did not rush to reach for a towel. She simply covered her mouth with her manicured hand to stifle a cruel giggle, her eyes maliciously dancing with dark amusement. "Oops. Oh no," she stated, her voice heavily dripping with vicious sarcasm. "My hand just slipped. I guess I'm just so emotionally shaken up by seeing you looking like this, Arya. Maybe you really should be much more careful about where you place your things." She slowly grabbed a tiny paper napkin from the medical tray, but instead of helping me dry my burning skin, she obsessively dabbed at a microscopic, invisible droplet on her own expensive dress, entirely ignoring the visible steam rising from my blistering skin. I looked desperately at Garrett, pleading with my eyes for just a tiny shred of human decency. "Garrett, please help me. It burns so badly. Please. Get a nurse." Garrett did not take a single step toward the bed. He moved rapidly toward Jessica. He gently took her hands, meticulously checking her flawless skin for any potential splashes. "Are you okay, babe?" he asked frantically, his back completely turned to my agonizing suffering. "Did any of that gross water get on your Gucci?" I am totally fine, Jessica purred, leaning heavily into his chest and casting a highly triumphant, wicked look over his shoulder directly at me. I was just a little startled by her dramatic screaming. It is so incredibly unladylike. Garrett turned back to face me, his handsome features twisted into a mask of absolute, unbridled disgust. Stop making such a pathetic scene, Arya. It was clearly an accident. God, you are always so incredibly dramatic and exhausting. This is exactly why I am permanently leaving you. You entirely suck the positive energy out of every single room you enter. Then, he did the one specific thing that psychologically hurt far more than the boiling burn on my leg. He forcefully pulled Jessica into his arms right there at the foot of my hospital bed. He grabbed her tiny waist, pulling her flush against his expensive suit, and kissed her. It wasn't a quick, polite peck on the cheek. It was a deep, aggressive, wildly passionate, and highly possessive kiss. The exact kind of kiss he hadn't given me in over 3 years. He desperately wanted me to see it. He actively wanted to violently brand the painful image into my traumatized mind, to show me exactly what I was losing and what he was gaining. When he finally pulled away, Jessica was heavily breathless, openly smirking at me with swollen, red lips. Garrett calmly smoothed his expensive lapel and looked down at me with those cold, dead eyes. "Take a really good look, Arya," he stated, his voice incredibly low and cruel, like a judge happily delivering a permanent death sentence. "This stunning woman right here is exactly what true success looks like. This is high class. This is pure elegance. She is my future. She is the luxury penthouse, the private chartered jet, the glamorous cover of magazines." He pointed a manicured, accusatory finger directly at me, his expression filled with absolute contempt. "And you are the forgotten past. You are the dusty, moldy antique shop, the pathetic coupon clipping, the broken-down, totaled car. You are absolute trash, Arya. And I am finally taking out the garbage." The horrific physical burn on my leg was absolutely nothing compared to the deep scorch mark those words left permanently on my soul. They didn't just want to divorce me. They actively wanted to obliterate my spirit. But as Garrett proudly guided Jessica toward the door, acting as though he were physically protecting her from the sheer filth of my presence, he made a catastrophic, fatal error. He arrogantly assumed that trash couldn't recycle itself into something incredibly dangerous. He assumed the past always stayed dead. He was dead wrong. The heavy hospital door had barely latched shut behind my terrible husband and his mistress before a stern woman in a stiff, gray business suit briskly walked in. She did not wear medical scrubs or a doctor's white coat. She wore the grim uniform of corporate bureaucracy. She tightly held a digital tablet in her hand and aggressively tapped the glass screen with a stylus that made a sharp, irritating sound. "Mrs. Vance," she stated without even bothering to look up, "we have officially ceased all non-emergency medical care. Your primary insurance holder has completely removed you from his policy, effective immediately. We attempted to run your secondary credit card on file, but it was instantly declined for highly insufficient funds." I desperately tried to sit up, but the screaming pain in my leg firmly anchored me to the mattress. "Can I please just make a quick phone call?" I pleaded, my voice shaking. "I just need a few hours to financially sort this out." The bureaucratic woman finally looked at me, but her eyes were entirely empty. "This is a highly private medical facility, Mrs. Vance, not a homeless shelter. We have already arranged for your immediate transport." She coldly signaled out into the hallway, and 2 burly, unsmiling orderlies immediately stepped in. They didn't gently handle me with the care of trained medical professionals. They aggressively handled me like expired, rotten inventory that needed to be rapidly cleared from the shelves. They forcefully lifted me from the warm bed onto a standard, uncomfortable wheelchair, my heavy cast bumping incredibly painfully against the cold metal footrests. They rapidly wheeled me down the busy hallway past the main nurses' station, where absolutely no one looked up. Everyone was far too busy staring blankly at their screens or quietly gossiping about the intense drama that had just unfolded in room 304. I was completely invisible. I was already a forgotten ghost. The agonizing elevator ride down to the ground floor felt exactly like a slow descent into hell. When the metal doors finally opened, the orderlies forcefully pushed me toward the main exit. The automatic glass doors rapidly slid open, and the deafening city noise rushed in, accompanied by a brutal gust of freezing, wet wind. It was raining much harder now, a cold, relentless, freezing drizzle that turned the New York streets into a miserable gray blur. The orderlies callously pushed the wheelchair right to the very edge of the concrete curb. "Good luck, lady," one of them casually muttered before instantly turning around and walking back into the comforting warmth of the lobby, leaving me entirely alone in the storm. I sat there trapped in the incredibly thin hospital gown, shivering violently and uncontrollably. I desperately clutched the cheap, yellow plastic hospital bag containing my wallet and house keys tightly against my chest, desperately trying to shield them from the freezing rain. My cast was already rapidly soaking up the dirty water, becoming incredibly heavy and freezing cold against my raw skin. I felt incredibly small. I felt utterly discarded. I was a woman who had technically woken up a multimillionaire, but was currently sitting on a wet curb looking exactly like a beggar. Then, I heard the aggressive, loud roar of a luxury engine. I looked up through the freezing rain and saw a sleek, massive black SUV aggressively peeling out of the hospital's private parking garage. It was Garrett's car. I could clearly see them both through the tinted windshield. Garrett was driving with one hand confidently on the wheel, laughing loudly as he gestured wildly to Jessica in the passenger seat. They looked incredibly warm. They looked deliriously happy. They looked exactly like winners. Garrett saw me. I know for a fact he did. He looked right at me sitting pathetically there in the rain. But instead of slowing down, he purposefully swerved the massive vehicle slightly to the right, driving dangerously closer to the curb. The massive, expensive tires of the SUV forcefully hit a deep, massive pothole completely filled with oily, murky, freezing street sludge. A massive wall of brown, filthy water violently slammed into me. It completely coated my face, my hair, and my fresh plaster cast in absolute filth. The disgusting taste of motor oil and street grit filled my mouth. I gasped in shock, frantically wiping the toxic sludge from my stinging eyes just in time to see the bright red taillights of the SUV rapidly disappear around the corner. I could easily imagine Jessica's cruel laughter echoing warmly inside the dry cabin. I sat there, completely dripping with dirty, freezing water, shivering violently in the cold. I waited patiently for the tears to come. I waited for the massive sob that would finally break me, but it never arrived. Instead, a completely different, terrifying sensation started rapidly growing in the dead center of my chest. It was incredibly hot and razor-sharp. It burned significantly brighter and hotter than the horrible scald mark on my leg. It was pure hatred. Pure, freezing cold, crystallized hatred. I slowly wiped the foul mud from my cheek and stared blankly at the empty street where they had just vanished. They genuinely thought they had drowned me. They didn't know they had just generously watered the deep seeds of their own total destruction. I sat alone on that freezing curb for exactly 5 minutes. I didn't shed a single tear. I coldly calculated. Garrett thought he had successfully stripped me of absolutely everything, but he had missed one tiny detail. I slowly reached into the zippered pocket of my soaking wet handbag, and my freezing fingers closed tightly around a piece of cold metal. It was a single, solitary quarter. A coin so incredibly insignificant that Garrett hadn't even bothered to steal it when he drained the accounts. It was the only tangible thing standing between me and death. I painfully dragged myself upright, heavily using the arm of the wheelchair for crucial support. My wet cast scraped terribly against the rough concrete pavement, sending fresh, blinding waves of agony shooting up my leg, but I fiercely gritted my teeth. I absolutely would not collapse. Not yet. There was a filthy, graffiti-covered payphone attached to the brick wall of a bodega roughly 10 feet away. It was an ancient relic of a bygone era, exactly like Garrett had claimed I was. I slowly, painfully limped toward it, dragging my utterly useless leg through the freezing puddles. I slotted the quarter in and rapidly dialed the private number I had meticulously memorized 5 years ago, the direct number of Silas Sterling's private legal counsel. It rang once, twice, and then a crisp, highly professional voice answered. "Sterling and Associates." I took a deep, shuddering breath, inhaling the harsh scent of stale rain and toxic exhaust fumes. "This is Arya Vance. I'm officially calling to claim my inheritance and I need immediate extraction." There was a tense pause on the other end, a heavy silence that lasted a heartbeat too long. Then the voice entirely shifted, losing its robotic edge. "Mrs. Vance, we have been desperately trying to reach you." Mr. Sterling left incredibly strict, ironclad instructions for this exact scenario. "Do not move an inch. We have your phone's location trace active. I hung up the heavy receiver and slumped heavily onto the freezing metal bench of the bus stop. It was covered in sticky gum and wet trash, but I was far too physically exhausted to care. City people rapidly walked past me, intentionally averting their eyes. To them, I was just another tragic homeless woman in New York City, a pathetic cautionary tale to be actively ignored. I waited. 10 freezing minutes passed, then 20. Just as I began to genuinely think I had hallucinated the entire phone call, the very atmosphere on the street completely changed. A massive, incredibly sleek vehicle slowly turned the corner. It wasn't just a regular car. It was a phantom, a matte black custom Maybach limousine that looked exactly like it belonged in a heavily guarded presidential motorcade. It glided silently through the chaotic traffic, effortlessly parting the sea of yellow taxis and beat-up city sedans. It slowed to a smooth halt right in front of the filthy bus stop. The stark contrast was incredibly jarring. The ultimate global symbol of unimaginable wealth parked right next to a pile of wet garbage. The heavy rear door opened, and a tall man in a flawless black suit stepped out, holding a massive black umbrella. He didn't look at the foul filth covering my clothes. He didn't look at the thick mud caked in my hair. He looked me directly in the eye with absolute profound deference. "Mrs. Vance," he stated, bowing deeply. "Mr. Blackwell sent me. Please allow me to assist you." He gently offered me his hand. It was flawlessly gloved in stark white cotton. I looked down at my own shaking hand, heavily stained with street sludge. I hesitated. He didn't flinch. He reached out firmly and took my dirty hand in his, gently pulling me from the freezing bench. As I slowly sank into the incredibly heated, buttery leather seats of the massive limousine and the heavy door closed, completely shutting out the freezing cold and the harsh city noise, I fully realized the game had entirely changed. I wasn't the tragic victim anymore. I was the master player holding the ultimate ace up her sleeve. As the massive limousine glided silently through the rain-soaked streets of Manhattan, I sank even deeper into the buttersoft leather seats. My soaking wet clothes were horribly staining the immaculate luxury upholstery, but Mr. Blackwell, sitting calmly across from me, did not seem to mind in the slightest. He silently opened a hidden, climate-controlled compartment and handed me a chilled bottle of sparkling water and a steaming warm towel. "Drink, Mrs. Vance," he stated, his voice incredibly calm and steady. "You are entirely safe now." I gratefully took the towel, aggressively wiping the toxic street sludge from my face. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the glass bottle. "Why?" I whispered. "Why are you helping me like this? I don't have a single dollar to pay you." Blackwell smiled a very small, sad smile. He slowly placed a heavy leather briefcase on his lap and loudly clicked the gold latches open. "You do not need to pay me. I am the chief executor of the estate of the late Silas Sterling." My breath completely hitched. Silas. The powerful name brought back a flood of memories of the grumpy, incredibly stubborn 80-year-old man I had faithfully visited every single Tuesday for the past 5 years. He was a wealthy client at the antique restoration firm where I worked. He was widely known for being incredibly difficult, impossibly demanding, and horribly rude to absolutely everyone. Everyone, that is, except me. I was the only person who tolerated his explosive temper because I clearly saw the deep, agonizing loneliness hiding behind it. I brought him hot peppermint tea. I patiently listened to his endless stories about his past. I genuinely thought he was just a retired, wealthy history professor living on a massive pension in a cluttered, dusty apartment. I was incredibly wrong. Blackwell pulled out a thick, heavy legal document bound in deep blue velvet. Silas Sterling was not a mere professor. He was the brilliant, silent founder of Sterling Luxury Group, one of the largest private corporate conglomerates in the entire world. He entirely owned massive commercial real estate, global shipping lines, and 3 of the top elite European fashion houses. He had children and spoiled grandchildren, but they only ever visited when they desperately needed cash. He absolutely despised them. He called them vultures. Blackwell slowly slid the heavy document toward me. "Last week, exactly 2 days before he tragically passed away from heart failure, he completely rewrote his final will. He specifically said you were the only person in 10 years who genuinely remembered his birthday without being heavily reminded. He said you were the absolute only one who looked at him and clearly saw a human being, not a walking checkbook." I stared blankly at the paper. The insane numbers swam dizzily before my eyes. Cash assets totaling $48 million. $40 $8 million. The luxurious cabin spun. That was significantly more money than Garrett would ever see in 10 lifetimes. Blackwell wasn't finished. The liquid cash is strictly for your personal, immediate use, Mrs. Vance, but the vast bulk of the estate is the global company itself. You are officially now the majority shareholder and the acting chairwoman of the board for Sterling Luxury Group. You literally own it all. I looked closely at the attached list of massive subsidiaries. My eyes widened in shock as I recognized the famous names. Lumiere Jewelry, Velvet and Silk, Mason Crimson. My heart hammered wildly against my bruised ribs. Mason Crimson. That was the exact brand Jessica religiously worshipped. It was the specific brand she was currently wearing, the brand she was practically begging to model for online. I looked down at the legal papers and then down at my broken leg wrapped in wet, cheap plaster. The irony was incredibly suffocating. The woman who had just mocked me for being poor was intensely desperate for a modeling contract with a company I now entirely owned. I wasn't just wealthy. I was officially her boss. I was her god. Blackwell watched me incredibly closely. Silas knew you were trapped in a highly difficult, toxic marriage. He knew your cruel husband did not appreciate you. He wanted to give you the absolute means to permanently rewrite your own story. Do you officially accept this massive inheritance, Mrs. Vance? I thought of Garrett's cruel, barking laugh. I thought of Jessica maliciously pouring boiling water on my cast. I looked at Blackwell, and for the very first time since the devastating accident, I didn't feel any pain. I felt immense, intoxicating power. I accept, I stated, my voice completely steady. But I have one strict condition. No one can know, not yet. I desperately need to heal and I need to prepare. Blackwell nodded, loudly closing the heavy briefcase. As you wish, chairwoman, we will immediately take you to a highly private medical facility upstate. Your total rehabilitation begins tonight, and when you finally return, New York will absolutely not know what hit it. Mr. Blackwell did not hand me the gold pen immediately. He held the blue velvet folder open, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the document. Before you sign, Mrs. Vance, there is one major stipulation. Silas was a brilliant strategist. He knew that simply handing you this massive empire would immediately paint a huge target on your back. The greedy sharks on the board of directors would try to eat you alive, and your sociopathic husband would undoubtedly try to claw his way back into your life for a massive payout. I leaned forward, completely ignoring the painful throbbing in my leg. What is the condition? You must remain an absolute ghost, Blackwell stated, his eyes highly serious behind his wire-rimmed glasses. For the next solid 6 months, you are to entirely disappear. You cannot contact absolutely anyone from your past life. No friends, no family members, and certainly not Garrett Vance. To the entire world, you are a destitute, tragic woman who simply vanished into the brutal homeless shelter system. In reality, you will be comfortably living at the heavily guarded Sterling private estate upstate. During this time, you will undergo incredibly intensive physical rehabilitation and rigorous corporate training. Silas wanted you to properly use this time to systematically purge the company of incompetent leadership, and more importantly, to purge your personal life of incredibly toxic elements. I looked out the tinted window at the rain-blurred city. 6 months. 6 months of letting Garrett and Jessica genuinely think they had won. 6 months of letting them blindly dig a financial hole so deep they would never, ever climb out. It was absolutely perfect. It wasn't a restriction. It was a loaded weapon. I took the heavy gold fountain pen from Blackwell. The premium ink flowed perfectly smoothly as I signed my name. Not just Arya Vance, but Arya Sterling, the powerful name Silas had requested I take as his spiritual successor. I agree, I stated, closing the velvet folder. Let them think I am dead. The massive limousine did not stop at a city shelter. It drove 3 hours directly north to a highly secluded, elite facility hidden behind massive iron gates and hundreds of acres of pine forest. An elite medical team was frantically waiting for me. These were not the overworked, exhausted interns at the city hospital. These were world-class, brilliant orthopedic surgeons specially flown in from Switzerland. The lead surgeon carefully examined the cheap, terrible plaster cast Garrett had authorized. He shook his head in absolute disgust. Barbaric, he muttered angrily. If you had worn this garbage for another week, you would have been permanently crippled. We are going to carefully remove this immediately. We will expertly perform a total reconstructive surgery utilizing state-of-the-art titanium rods and grafts. You will absolutely walk again, Mrs. Sterling, and you will walk in high H. Eels if you so choose to. I was quickly wheeled into the pristine operating room. The lights were incredibly bright and clean, completely unlike the flickering, depressing fluorescence of the ICU. As the anesthesia mask was gently placed over my face, I didn't bother counting backwards. I vividly visualized Garrett's face when he finally realized his catastrophic mistake. I visualized Jessica's horrified scream. The darkness rapidly took me, but for the first time in days, I wasn't afraid. When I finally woke up, the pain was entirely different. It wasn't the dull, hopeless ache of medical neglect. It was the incredibly sharp, highly productive pain of actual healing. My legs were firmly encased in state-of-the-art medical braces, not heavy, cheap plaster. A tough physical therapist was already standing firmly by my bed with a rigorous schedule that looked much more like elite military training than basic recovery. I looked at the digital calendar on the wall. Day 1 of my 6-month sentence. I tightly clenched my fists, physically feeling real strength return to my body. I had massive work to do. And while I systematically rebuilt myself bone by bone, Garrett was out there recklessly spending money he absolutely didn't have, unknowingly sprinting blindly toward a finish line I had just intentionally moved. My peaceful sanctuary did not remain unviolated for long. I was right in the middle of a grueling, sweaty physical therapy session, desperately trying to teach my atrophied muscles how to fire again when the head nurse walked in. She looked highly hesitant. "Mrs. Sterling, I sincerely apologize for the interruption, but there is an incredibly loud woman at the front gate. She claims to be your biological sister. She loudly says it is a dire family emergency, and she firmly refuses to leave until she sees you." My heart skipped a painful beat. Chloe. For a split second, a foolish, naive part of me genuinely hoped she had come to save me. Maybe she had heard about the horrific accident and bravely defied Garrett to bring me comfort. Maybe she had brought Mom's old handmade quilt, or just a warm hug. I told the nurse to let her into the private visitor lounge. I quickly adjusted my expensive silk robe, carefully covering the high-tech titanium braces on my legs, and wheeled myself into the lavish room. Chloe was standing by the massive window, looking out at the manicured botanical gardens. She was absolutely not crying. She did not look frantic or worried. She looked incredibly annoyed. When she turned to see me, she didn't rush over to hug me. She didn't even bother to ask how I was physically feeling. She looked critically at my wheelchair and then rapidly scanned the room, deeply assessing the luxury furniture, the expensive artwork, and the highly obvious cost of the private facility. "Well," she stated, aggressively crossing her arms over her chest, "you certainly landed right on your feet for a cripple. Garrett told me you were pathetic and sleeping on a dirty park bench. Looks like you found yourself a rich sugar daddy after all." The sheer venom in her voice stunned me. "Chloe, I was literally in a coma. Garrett intentionally left me for dead. I'm currently undergoing painful reconstructive surgery." She aggressively rolled her eyes. "Save the ridiculous drama, Arya. I'm not here for a pathetic sob story. I am here because Garrett hired an expensive private investigator to track you down. He managed to trace that fancy black limo that picked you up. He firmly thinks you stole money from him before the crash. He says there is a massive secret slush fund you hid away, and that is exactly how you are paying for all this luxury." I tightly gripped the armrests of my chair. "Garrett is a massive liar, Chloe. He stole our entire life savings." "I have absolutely nothing that belongs to him." Chloe stepped closer, her eyes narrowing greedily. "I really don't care who stole what, Arya. I really don't. But here is the current situation. Garrett is actively offering a $2,000 cash reward for your exact location. He wants to legally serve you with a massive lawsuit for fraud. But I told myself, why help Garrett when I can easily help family, right?" She pulled out her phone and opened her banking app, showing me a glaring negative balance. "My rent is incredibly late, Arya, and that absolute deadbeat boyfriend of mine just quit his job again. So here is the deal. You transfer $5,000 to my account right this second, and I will go back to Garrett and tell him the pie was entirely wrong. I will tell him you are dead or you permanently moved to Mexico." I stared at her, utterly unable to process the blatant extortion. "You are actively blackmailing me. I am your sister. I almost died and you are aggressively shaking me down for rent money." Chloe simply shrugged, causally picking out a loose thread on her sweater. Survival of the fittest, sis. You obviously have money now. Just look at this ridiculous place. 5 grand is absolute nothing to you. But if you don't pay up, I will send a live geopin directly to Garrett right now. He will be here in an hour with his lawyers and maybe the police. So, what is it going to be? I looked at the woman I had grown up with, the woman I used to share a tiny bunk bed with. I realized then that the deep rot in my life didn't just start with Garrett. It ran like a disease through my entire bloodline. She didn't see a sister in agonizing pain. She saw a walking ATM, and exactly like Garrett, she had made a catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. She foolishly thought she was cornering a weak victim, but she was actually handing me the final, necessary reason I needed to cut the cord completely. I reached for my phone, not to transfer the money, but to initiate a security protocol I had prepared with Blackwell. I needed to be absolutely certain before I cut the family cord forever. So I decided to give her one last, final test, one final opportunity to prove there was a beating human heart beneath that designer sweater. "Chloe," I said, my voice intentionally trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the immense weight of the moment. "I don't have $5,000. This facility is strictly being paid for by a victim assistance grant because I am entirely destitute. I have exactly $0 in my bank account. If you tell Garrett where I am, he will come here and cause a massive scene that will absolutely get me kicked out. I will be on the freezing street again. Is that really what you want? Do you genuinely care more about a new handbag than your own sister's basic survival?" I waited, holding my breath, desperately hoping she would soften, hoping she would say she was sorry. But Chloe didn't soften. She hardened. Her face twisted into a highly ugly mask of pure contempt. She stood up abruptly, knocking her luxury chair back. "You are lying," she hissed. "You always hold out on me. You always think you are so much better than everyone else just because you read stupid books and save money. Well, look exactly where that got you." Then she did something that permanently severed the absolute last thread of my attachment to her. She stepped forward and forcefully spat on the polished hardwood floor right next to the wheel of my chair. It was a vile, deeply visceral act of profound disrespect. "You are completely useless, Arya," she sneered, looking down at me exactly like I was something disgusting she had stepped in. "Absolutely useless. No wonder Garrett left you. No wonder he significantly upgraded to Jessica. At least she knows how to actually hustle. At least she is fun. You are just a massive dead weight. Mom was entirely right. We should have kicked you out the day you turned 18. The terrible words hung heavily in the air, highly toxic and final. But instead of breaking me, they entirely liberated me. I didn't feel sad anymore. I felt deeply, coldly surgical. I casually tapped the screen of my phone, which had been resting on my lap. "Thank you, Chloe," I stated, my voice completely dropping the weak act entirely. I was actively recording this entire conversation for my legal records. I now have hard audio proof of extortion and blackmail. Chloe laughed nervously. "You are bluffing, and even if you aren't, who cares? Who's going to believe a cripple over me?" I pressed a tiny red button on the side of my wheelchair console. It was the silent alarm for elite security. 2 massive men in dark suits appeared at the door almost instantly. They weren't the lazy hospital orderlies who had tossed me out in New York. These were elite, private security contractors paid for directly by the Sterling estate. "Remove this woman from the premises," I ordered, my voice suddenly echoing with a terrifying new authority, "and ensure she is permanently banned from ever entering this property again. If she returns, call the police immediately and file heavy charges." For trespassing and attempted extortion. Chloe's jaw dropped in horror. She looked rapidly from the massive guards to me, realizing far too late that she had grossly miscalculated the massive power dynamic. "Wait, Arya," she stammered, panic setting in. "I was just joking. You know I just have a bad temper." "Get her out," I commanded, turning my wheelchair around so I wouldn't have to look at her pathetic face. As the huge guards aggressively dragged her out, her loudly protesting and cursing, I felt incredibly lighter. The family toxicity was permanently gone. I wheeled myself over to the massive window and looked out at the peaceful forest. I had lost a sister, but I had gained absolute clarity. Now there were 0 distractions left. It was time to entirely focus on the reconstruction, not just of my shattered legs, but of my massive empire. And when I was finally done, Garrett and Chloe would desperately wish they had treated the useless sister with a little more respect. 3 agonizing months, 90 brutal days of sweat, tears, and cold titanium. That is exactly what it took to kill Arya Vance and give birth to Arya Sterling. The rehabilitation center was not a relaxing spa. It was a blazing forge. Every single morning, I aggressively woke up before dawn, pushing my battered body to the absolute maximum limit. The pain in my legs was constant and intense, but I entirely welcomed it. It was a daily reminder that I was alive. It was premium fuel. Slowly, the wheelchair became a heavy walker. The walker became an elegant cane. And finally, the cane was confidently left leaning against a wall, gathering dust. When I finally walked out of those massive iron gates, I was completely unrecognizable. The mousy, quiet woman who hid behind oversized, frumpy cardigans and messy hair buns was permanently gone. I sat in the luxury salon chair of the most incredibly exclusive stylist in Manhattan and coldly told him to cut it all off. My hair was now a severely sharp, angled bob that framed my face like a dangerous blade. My wardrobe was no longer pathetic bargain bin finds. It was highly expensive armor. Tailored blazers from Milan, structural power dresses that screamed absolute authority, and 4-inch stilettos that clicked loudly against the marble floors with the terrifying rhythm of a ticking clock. I didn't just look like money. I looked like pure, concentrated power. I stood confidently in the center of the massive executive suite on the very top floor of the Sterling luxury tower. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a stunning panoramic view of the exact city that had chewed me up and violently spit me out. Now, I was looking down on it, both literally and figuratively. My reflection in the glass was freezing cold and highly imposing. I didn't see a pathetic victim anymore. I saw an apex predator who had spent months meticulously studying her prey. Mr. Blackwell stood completely silent and respectful by the door, waiting for my absolute command. I slowly walked over to the massive mahogany desk that had once belonged to Sela's. It was entirely empty except for a single, thick leather folder lying perfectly in the center. I slowly ran my manicured fingers over the cover before aggressively flipping it open. It wasn't a standard business proposal. It was a brutal forensic financial autopsy of Garrett's life over the last 90 days. The numbers were absolutely staggering, in the best possible way. The dossier meticulously detailed every single foolish, desperate move he had made. The insane high-interest loans he took out to pay for a lavish wedding. The desperate second mortgage on the house he had stolen from me. The completely maxed-out credit cards used solely to fund Jessica's absurd wardrobe. He was completely drowning in toxic debt, living a pathetic lie funded entirely by borrowed time. And the specific bank that held all those highly toxic notes. The bank that was about to viciously call in his loans. It was a massive subsidiary I had aggressively acquired just this morning. I picked up the glossy photo clipped to the file. It was a paparazzi shot of Garrett and Jessica laughing wildly at an exclusive nightclub, completely unaware that the ground beneath them was already violently crumbling. I traced Garrett's fake, smiling face with my finger. He looked so incredibly confident, so disgustingly arrogant. He had absolutely no idea that the woman he left for dead now completely owned the very air he was breathing. I closed the thick folder with a highly satisfying thud. The loud sound echoed in the silent office exactly like a gunshot. I turned to Blackwell, who was holding a secure phone, ready to officially execute the first massive phase of the acquisition. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice incredibly steady and entirely devoid of mercy. Call the bank. Instantly freeze their assets. Let's begin. While I was meticulously orchestrating the silent, hostile takeover of the banking world from my glass tower, Garrett was incredibly busy proving exactly why he desperately needed to be destroyed. He didn't just move on from our marriage. He staged a massive, vulgar spectacle. He completely took the $200,000 he had stolen from our joint savings and the massive proceeds from selling the home we had built together, and he practically set fire to it all in a single, ridiculous night. The wedding was lavishly held at the Plaza Hotel. It was an incredibly gaudy event designed not for actual love, but purely for Instagram aesthetics. There were massive walls of white roses imported from Ecuador, a ridiculous 10-tier cake entirely covered in edible gold leaf, and a shallow guest list that included every C-list celebrity and desperate social climber in Manhattan. Garrett stood proudly at the altar in a custom tuxedo that cost significantly more than my first year of college tuition, flashing that fake winning smile that had once foolishly fooled me. To the clueless world, he looked like the absolute picture of the American dream, a self-made real estate mogul marrying a stunning supermodel. I coldly watched the live stream from my office, my face totally impassive. A reporter from a local business channel shoved a microphone directly in Garrett's face during the loud reception. "Mr. Vance, you seem to be completely on top of the world. What exactly is the secret to your sudden explosion of wealth?" Garrett laughed loudly, wrapping an arm tightly around Jessica, who was far too busy checking her makeup in the reflection of a champagne flute. "It is all about having incredible vision," he stated smoothly. "You have to know exactly when to cut the dead weight and when to heavily invest in prime assets. My real estate empire, Vance Enterprises, is currently expanding rapidly. We are actively looking at acquiring some massive commercial zones next quarter. This lavish wedding is just a small celebration of the incredible abundance that is coming." He was lying directly through his veneered teeth. My elite forensic accountants had already completely traced the money trail. The $200,000 from our house was entirely gone before the appetizers were even served. To fund this pathetic circus, Garrett had desperately turned to the dark, dangerous underbelly of finance. He had taken out 3 massive hard money loans with predatory, insane interest rates, using his entirely non-existent future commissions as fake collateral. He was literally borrowing from violent loan sharks just to impress shallow people who didn't care if he lived or died. Jessica, of course, was entirely oblivious. She was floating high on a cloud of absolute delusion. "Babe," she whined loudly, aggressively tugging on his sleeve while the cameras were actively rolling. "The champagne isn't nearly vintage enough. I specifically told the caterer I wanted the 98 Dom Perignon. This tastes exactly like cheap tap water." Garrett's fake smile heavily faltered for a fraction of a second. A visible bead of sweat trickled down his temple, completely betraying the intense panic rising rapidly beneath the surface. He nervously patted her hand. "I will handle it instantly, princess. Nothing but the absolute best for you." He stepped slightly away from the bright cameras, frantically pulling out his phone. I zoomed in tightly on the screen using the high-definition footage. He wasn't calling the hotel caterer. He was checking an aggressive text message from a number listed as "Do Not Answer." The terrifying text read, "You completely missed the weekly payment, Vance. Interest just doubled. You have exactly 48 hours. He forcefully shoved the phone back into his pocket and desperately downed a massive glass of champagne in one gulp. He looked around the ballroom, intensely desperate for validation, desperate to genuinely believe his own lies. He thought he was the ultimate king of New York. He didn't realize he was a pathetic jester dancing blindly on a trapdoor. And I was the one securely holding the lever. He wanted a massive commercial zone acquisition. I decided right then and there to give him one. I would expertly dangle the bait so incredibly enticing he would literally mortgage his soul to grab it. And when he finally did, I would own him completely. While Garrett was sweating profusely through his expensive tuxedo, frantically trying to hide his total financial ruin, Jessica was about to make the monumental mistake that would permanently seal their fate. 2 days after the gaudy wedding, a courier arrived at their rented penthouse suite, carrying a heavy package wrapped in midnight blue velvet. It was legally sealed with the gold crest of Lumiere, the most highly exclusive jewelry house in Paris, and the crown jewel of my massive new empire. Jessica violently tore into the expensive package like a greedy child on Christmas morning. When she saw the official letterhead, she actually screamed in joy. It was a legal contract, a massive proposal for her tea. Oh, become the global face of the upcoming Stars of Eternity campaign. This was the exact contract she had spent her entire pathetic career frantically chasing. It meant massive billboards in Times Square, exclusive red carpet access, and a huge retainer fee that would instantly solve all their financial problems. She didn't wait a second. She rushed rapidly to the Lumiere headquarters in Midtown for the official signing meeting. She arrogantly walked into the executive conference room wearing designer sunglasses indoors, acting exactly like she already owned the massive place. She had absolutely no idea that I was coldly watching her from the hidden security camera feed in my office 20 floors above. My elite attorney sat calmly across from her, pushing a thick, heavy document across the glass table. "We are incredibly thrilled to have you, Jessica," he stated, his voice smooth and highly professional. "However, Lumiere is a historic brand entirely built on purity and timeless elegance. We take our pristine public image very seriously." Jessica waved her hand entirely dismissively, heavily checking her reflection in her compact mirror. Yeah, I totally get it. I am a brand ambassador. I absolutely know the drill. Where exactly do I sign?" The attorney slowly flipped the contract to page 42. "I must clearly draw your attention to the extremely strict morality clause in Section 8. It legally stipulates that the ambassador must actively maintain an impeccable public image. Any behavior deemed highly scandalous, unethical, or damaging to the brand will result in immediate, absolute termination of the contract. Furthermore, due to the extreme high value of the jewelry involved, such a massive breach carries a strict liquidated damages penalty of $10 million. $10 million. Most rational people would immediately pause. Most people would desperately call a lawyer. But Jessica was not most people. She was entirely blinded by her own massive ego. She saw the huge number and didn't see a legal threat. She saw an ultimate validation of her fake worth. She arrogantly assumed she was so incredibly valuable that the penalty had to be high. She didn't even bother to read the specific paragraph defining scandalous behavior. If she had, she would have clearly seen that it explicitly included cyberbullying, public harassment, and fraud. The very terrible things she had built her entire online persona on. "I am absolutely not going to cause a scandal," she scoffed loudly, uncapping her expensive pen. "I am a famous influencer. People totally love me. I am literally America's absolute sweetheart." She quickly scrolled her messy signature on the dotted line with a massive flourish. The scratching sound of the pen against the paper was the most incredibly beautiful sound I had heard in months. It was the absolute sound of a steel trap violently snapping shut. She smiled brightly for a selfie with the contract, captioning it, "Major boss moves." She genuinely thought she had just secured her entire future. In reality, she had just legally handed me the exact weapon I would use to entirely bankrupt her. She confidently walked out of that massive building floating on air, completely oblivious to the terrifying fact that she had just legally sold her entire life to the woman she aggressively tried to destroy. The ink on Jessica's contract was barely even dry when I executed my next move. While she was cluelessly celebrating her future, I was incredibly busy buying up her husband's toxic past. I sat calmly in the boardroom of Sterling Holdings, heavily surrounded by a team of elite, shark-like financial analysts. On the massive screen in front of us was a digital map of Garrett's entire financial life. It was an absolute disaster zone of bright red flags and horribly overleveraged assets. Mr. Blackwell stood calmly at the head of the long table, holding a laser pointer. "As you can clearly see, Madam Chairwoman, Mr. Vance has spread himself incredibly thin. To heavily finance the wedding and the massive down payment on the new penthouse, he took out insane loans from 3 entirely different high-risk lenders. These strongly constitute what we call distressed, toxic assets. The desperate lenders are extremely nervous. They know he is surviving on borrowed time, and they are desperately looking to sell the debt to rapidly recoup their losses." I closely studied the numbers. Garrett had leveraged absolutely everything. The massive penthouse was heavily mortgaged to the hilt. His luxury car was leased under highly predatory terms. Even the initial startup capital for his real estate firm was tightly tied to a dangerous variable interest loan that was about to completely skyrocket. He had built a massive castle on a fragile foundation of sand, and I was exactly about to turn on the high-pressure hose. "Buy it," I commanded, my voice easily cutting through the absolute silence of the room. "Buy absolutely all of it." One of the younger junior analysts looked up incredibly nervously. "All of it, ma'am. That is a highly significant amount of toxic debt. From a purely traditional investment standpoint, it is a guaranteed loss." I looked coldly at him, and he instantly shrank back into his leather chair. "This isn't an investment," I stated coldly. "It is a hostile acquisition. I want every single promissory note, every mortgage deed, and every max line of credit with Garrett Vance's signature on it." Use the aggressive shell company we set up, Nemesis Holdings. He must absolutely not know it is me. Not yet. Blackwell nodded, understanding the brutal game perfectly. He rapidly tapped a few keys on his laptop, expertly executing the trades. Within seconds, digital confirmations started rapidly rolling in. It was terrifyingly easy. With a few simple keystrokes, I had quietly and entirely stepped into the incredibly powerful shoes of the banks. I was no longer just his pathetic ex-wife. I was his landlord, his powerful banker, and the absolute owner of the very bed he slept in. I watched the green progress bar on the massive screen reach 100%. The acquisition was fully complete. Technically, I could legally foreclose on his massive home this very afternoon. I could have repo men repossess his luxury car while he was driving it. I could entirely freeze his business accounts and eagerly watch him panic. The massive power was absolutely intoxicating. It was a very far cry from the tragic woman who had begged for money to save her legs in a dirty hospital room. I stood up and confidently walked to the massive window, looking out at the glittering city skyline. Somewhere out there in that concrete jungle, Garrett was probably loudly popping another bottle of expensive champagne, genuinely thinking he had entirely gotten away with everything. He thought he was a powerful, self-made man. He had absolutely no idea that he was now a pathetic employee of Nemesis Holdings, and his brutal performance review was coming up very soon. "Keep the intense pressure off for now," I ordered Blackwell without even turning around. "Let him falsely think he is entirely safe. Let him spend a little more. I actively want him to feel entirely invincible right before I violently pull the rug out." Blackwell closed his laptop. "Understood completely." "And the legal notification regarding the mortgage transfer? Suppress it immediately," I ordered. "Send it directly to his spam folder if you have to. He never bothers to read the fine print anyway. That is exactly how he got into this massive mess." I picked up my purse, a highly limited edition leather piece that cost significantly more than Garrett's leased car. I officially had the debt. I officially had the contract. Now I desperately needed to see the happy couple in person. I absolutely needed to look deeply into their eyes and witness the sheer arrogance one last time before I entirely replaced it with absolute, suffocating fear. I confidently walked out of the boardroom, the sharp click of my heels echoing exactly like the countdown of a massive bomb. It was finally time to go shopping. I stepped smoothly out of the black town car and slightly adjusted my oversized designer sunglasses, completely shielding my eyes from the harsh glare of Madison Avenue. The flagship luxury store stood before me, a massive fortress of total exclusivity and unimaginable wealth. In my previous miserable life as Garrett's wife, I had been far too intimidated to even walk past the giant windows, let alone enter. I used to deeply worry that the security guards would somehow smell the poor middle class on me. Today, I walked straight through the heavy glass doors exactly like I owned the place, because, in a highly complicated legal sense regarding the building's lease, I actually did. The air inside was incredibly cool and heavily scented with the finest expensive leather and quiet desperation. I didn't have to look hard to easily find Jessica. Her loud voice aggressively cut through the hushed, elegant atmosphere like a highly serrated knife. She was aggressively standing by the expensive accessory counter, loudly berating a young, terrified sales associate who looked exactly like she was on the absolute verge of tears. "I specifically said the bright orange one, not the coral one." Jessica snapped violently, tossing a highly expensive silk scarf onto the glass counter as if it were a dirty rag. "Are you totally colorblind or just incredibly stupid? Do you possess any idea exactly who I am? I am the official face of Lumiere. I absolutely do not have the time for your pathetic incompetence." I suppressed a highly satisfying smirk. She was currently using the exact name of my company to aggressively bully a shopgirl. It was almost too poetic. I confidently walked past her deliberately, completely ignoring her loud presence, and approached the massive display case in the center of the room. Inside sat the absolute holy grail of handbags, a Himalayan Birkin with stunning diamond-encrusted hardware. It was a massive piece that strictly required a six-figure spend history just to be politely invited to purchase. The store manager, instantly recognizing me not as Aria Vance, but as the highly mysterious, ultra-wealthy Ms. Sterling from the private elite client list, rushed over immediately. He frantically unlocked the case with trembling hands. "Excellent choice, madam." This just arrived directly from Paris this morning. I slowly reached out to gently touch the textured leather, heavily admiring the craftsmanship. But before my fingers could make full contact, a hand with long, incredibly tacky manicured nails slapped violently onto the handle. Jessica had magically materialized beside me, her eyes wide with immense, unbridled greed. She didn't recognize me at all. To her, the mousy, broken Arya she knew was probably currently begging for change in a dirty shelter. The sharp woman standing before her with the severe bob and the bespoke, highly tailored suit was just another piece of competition. "Excuse me," Jessica stated, her voice heavily dripping with entirely fake politeness before instantly turning icy. "I was heavily looking at this first." She hadn't been, of course. She had been far too busy emotionally abusing the staff. But Jessica was a pathetic creature of envy. She only wanted expensive things when she saw someone else attempting to buy them. She violently yanked the massive bag toward her chest, aggressively clutching it like a lifeline. "Besides, do you even know exactly how much this actually costs? This is highly limited edition. It is strictly for A-list exclusive clientele." She looked me aggressively up and down, frantically scanning my outfit for loud logos. My expensive clothes were entirely custom-made, completely devoid of the flashy branding she pathetically worshipped, so she incorrectly assumed they were worthless. She scoffed, a disgusting sound of pure, unadulterated condescension. "Listen, honey, maybe you really should check the clearance rack at the local mall. This kind of massive investment requires real money, not just pathetic window shopping money." The sheer irony was utterly delicious. The woman who had just signed a massive contract with a strict morality clause was currently standing here acting exactly like a cheap street brawler over a purse she couldn't remotely afford. I slowly lowered my dark sunglasses just an inch, looking her dead in the eye. "Is that so?" I asked smoothly, my voice entirely unrecognizable. "Because from precisely where I am standing, you look exactly like someone who is desperately trying very hard to convince absolutely everyone she belongs here. And usually, the people who constantly have to scream loudly about their money are the exact ones who are rapidly running out of it." Jessica's face instantly turned an ugly shade of red that horribly clashed with her outfit. "How absolutely dare you? You have no idea exactly who I am. I am Jessica. I am a highly successful supermodel, and I am buying this exact bag right now just to spite you." She aggressively turned to the terrified salesgirl and violently slammed her black credit card onto the glass counter. "Ring it up instantly, and throw in the expensive scarf, too. I desperately want to show this pathetic nobody exactly what real, true wealth looks like." I calmly stepped back, elegantly folding my arms. I completely watched the salesgirl nervously pick up the black card. I knew exactly what was about to happen next, because exactly 10 minutes ago, I had sent an urgent text to the bank aggressively instructing them to lower the daily limit on that highly specific card to exactly 0. Jessica stood there loudly tapping her foot, smiling highly triumphantly at me, eagerly waiting for the long receipt that would absolutely never come. She was exactly about to learn that in my elite world, credit is a massive privilege, not a basic right. "You know what?" I stated calmly, smoothly smoothing the lapel of my blazer. "You are absolutely right. That expensive bag truly deserves to be exactly with someone who desperately needs to constantly prove their fake worth. Go ahead, take it." I casually gestured to the cashier with a highly magnanimous wave of my hand. Jessica blinked, clearly completely expecting a massive fight. When I didn't give her one, she actually looked disappointed, but her intense greed quickly took over completely. She aggressively turned her back to me, violently slamming the expensive crocodile skin bag onto the glass counter with a heavy thud. "Wrap it up immediately," she commanded, loudly snapping her fingers at the terrified salesgirl. "And make absolutely sure you put it in the giant orange box. I strongly want absolutely everyone on the street to know exactly where I have been." She cast one last, incredibly smug glance heavily over her shoulder at me. "Maybe if you aggressively save up for a few long years, you can actually come back and afford a cheap keychain. Ciao." I didn't bother to respond. I just patiently waited. I casually leaned against a glass display case of silk scarves and heavily checked my luxury watch. The banking algorithm I had deployed was incredibly precise. It wasn't a standard cancellation. It was a terrifying temporary security freeze, the exact kind that aggressively requires hours of intense phone calls to properly lift. Jessica loudly tapped her long acrylic nails against the glass as the salesgirl carefully inserted the heavy black metal card into the chip reader. The machine whirred for a second, silently processing the data. The absolute silence in the massive store was incredibly heavy, thick with the scent of expensive leather and absolute judgment. Then, it happened. A loud, incredibly dissonant buzz violently cut through the quiet. The glaring red light on the terminal aggressively flashed. "I am so incredibly sorry, ma'am," the salesgirl whispered, her face flushing bright pink. "The massive transaction was heavily declined." Jessica laughed, a nervous, incredibly high-pitched sound. "Don't be totally ridiculous. That is a highly exclusive black card. It has absolutely no limit. You obviously put it in completely wrong. Do it again." The terrified girl instantly obeyed. She carefully removed the card, wiped the gold chip on her blazer, and inserted it again. The machine thought about it for exactly 2 seconds this time. Buzz, declined, code 5, do not honor. "There strongly seems to be a massive hold on the entire account," the manager stated, stepping in incredibly smoothly to heavily shield his staff from Jessica's rapidly rising temper. "Do you perhaps have another form of payment?" Jessica's face went rapidly from horribly smug to entirely stricken in a single heartbeat. She frantically dug aggressively through her messy designer purse, rapidly pulling out a personal debit card and a platinum credit card. "Try these immediately," she hissed loudly. "And hurry up. Important people are aggressively staring." I silently watched with a very small, entirely imperceptible smile firmly behind my dark glasses. I knew absolutely those other cards wouldn't remotely work either. The specific debit card was linked directly to the empty joint account Garrett had drained. The platinum card was entirely maxed out from the gaudy wedding. One by one, the relentless machine rejected them all. Buzz, buzz. Each horrific sound was a massive hammer blow directly to her massive ego. The other elite customers, highly sophisticated women heavily draped in tweed and expensive pearls, entirely stopped their quiet browsing. They aggressively whispered behind their manicured hands. The massive security guard took a highly deliberate step closer. The total humiliation was absolute. Jessica was absolutely no longer the arrogant queen of the store. She was a pathetic fraud aggressively trying to shoplift prestige. "This is a massive mistake," Jessica shrieked loudly, her fake composure entirely shattering. She desperately grabbed her phone, her hands shaking so incredibly badly she dropped it once before frantically dialing. "Garrett, pick up. The card is aggressively declining. I am at the store, and they are looking at me exactly like I am a massive criminal. Fix it." "Transfer money right now," she was violently shouting, aggressively pacing back and forth, entirely ruining the highly exclusive atmosphere. The manager calmly gestured to security. "Ma'am, I am going to have to forcefully ask you to completely lower your voice or step outside." I smoothly pushed off the glass counter and confidently walked toward the massive exit. As I passed Jessica, who was totally on the absolute verge of loud tears, desperately screaming into her phone about highly unacceptable service, I paused. I slowly lowered my dark sunglasses just enough for her to clearly see my eyes, though she was far too blinded by panic to actually recognize them. "You know," I stated incredibly softly, "money actually talks, but true wealth only whispers. And right now, you are desperately, pathetically screaming." I walked smoothly out into the bright sunshine, completely leaving her violently trapped in a miserable hell of her exact own making, desperately waiting for a terrible husband who was just as entirely broke as she was. I sat calmly in the deep silence of my executive suite, entirely overlooking the massive city that now completely belonged to me. The bright sun was rapidly setting, aggressively casting incredibly long shadows completely across the massive glass desk where my new highly secure phone sat aggressively charging. It buzzed once, then twice. The screen prominently displayed a restricted number. I knew instantly exactly who it was. Only one pathetic person had the sheer, unbridled audacity to aggressively interrupt my absolute peace with such frantic, terrified energy. I calmly picked it up, but entirely didn't speak. I actively wanted him to completely fill the silence with his own immense fear. "Arya, I absolutely know you are there." Garrett's voice was absolutely not the smooth, arrogant baritone of the highly confident real estate mogul anymore. It was horribly jagged, highly high-pitched, and completely edged with intense panic. "I know for a fact you are aggressively pulling strings. My credit cards are entirely frozen. My bank accounts are heavily flagged. You really think you are highly clever, don't you? Hiding pathetically away and playing little childish pranks with the bank. I remained entirely silent, heavily pressing the record button on the massive console. Every single desperate word he spoke was being instantly saved, heavily encrypted, and sent directly to my elite legal team. You aggressively listen to me, and you listen entirely good, he hissed maliciously. The IRS is currently auditing the massive joint filing from exactly last year. They specifically found the huge offshore transfers. They are aggressively asking questions about the massive income I didn't legally declare. I am absolutely not going down for this mess. I heavily sent a legal document to your old email address. It is a legally sworn affidavit firmly stating that you were entirely responsible for the massive household finances and that you specifically made those highly illegal transfers without my knowledge purely due to a massive gambling addiction. I almost laughed entirely out loud. He aggressively wanted me to officially perjure myself. He genuinely wanted me to entirely take the massive fall for his massive tax evasion so he could entirely keep his pristine, entirely fake reputation. When I completely didn't answer, he violently switched tactics. He entirely went from angry to utterly venomous. If you absolutely don't sign it by midnight entirely tonight, I am going to entirely ruin you, Arya. I absolutely mean it. I will go directly to the press. I will aggressively go to every single social circle in Manhattan. I will confidently tell them the absolute reason we never had kids wasn't entirely because we were waiting. I will confidently tell them you aggressively terminated a pregnancy entirely behind my back heavily because you were far too incredibly selfish to actually be a mother. I will aggressively paint you exactly as a child killer. Good luck trying to ever find a new husband with that massive lie hanging entirely over your head. Good luck ever showing your pathetic face in church. The breath painfully caught in my throat. It was a massive, horrific lie. A monstrous, entirely vile lie. We had deeply struggled with agonizing infertility for long years, an immense pain that I had heavily carried entirely alone, while he constantly complained about the massive cost of treatments. To violently use that deep pain to actively weaponize a completely non-existent abortion was an entirely new level of utter depravity, even for him. You are entirely quiet now, aren't you? He arrogantly taunted, entirely mistaking my complete shock for pathetic submission. Sign the paper, Arya. Be the pathetic scapegoat one absolutely last time, and I will graciously let you completely fade away. Fight me, and I will aggressively burn your entire reputation completely to the ground. I finally spoke, my voice entirely calm, absolutely cold, and completely devoid of the intense fear he heavily expected. You really should be far more incredibly careful exactly who you intensely threaten, Garrett. You absolutely never know exactly who is actively listening. I aggressively hung up completely before he could legally respond. I absolutely didn't block the number. I deeply needed him to aggressively keep calling. I desperately needed him to completely keep digging. I looked entirely at the massive recording file on my bright screen. He had absolutely just admitted entirely to massive tax fraud and attempted extortion and blackmail in a single, highly recorded call. He genuinely thought he was heavily holding a massive gun to my head, but he had entirely just voluntarily handed me the exact, heavy bullets I would eagerly use to legally execute him. I aggressively forwarded the entire audio file directly to Mr. Blackwell with a 2-word aggressive note. Proceed immediately. I waited exactly 2 agonizing hours entirely before actively calling him heavily back. I deeply needed my voice to actively sound sufficiently shaky and terrified. I completely told him I was intensely terrified. I heavily told him I would absolutely do entirely anything to legally protect my pristine reputation. We met at a highly dimly lit, entirely cheap diner exactly on the dangerous edge of the city, a place we exactly used to frequently go when we were initially dating and intensely broke. I heavily wore an incredibly old, highly oversized sweater and absolute minimal makeup, completely hiding my entirely new, incredibly sharp bob heavily ender an old beanie. I entirely had to look exactly like the pathetic Arya he heavily remembered, the entirely weak Arya, the ultimate victim. Garrett was entirely already there, heavily sitting in a cheap booth, aggressively drumming his manicured fingers on the cheap Formica table. When he completely saw me, a highly smug smirk entirely curled his lip. He absolutely didn't see the massive fire entirely in my eyes. He completely only saw the pathetic slump of my entirely weak shoulders. "You completely look entirely terrible," he stated aggressively by way of greeting. "Living in a dirty shelter absolutely doesn't entirely suit you." I heavily slid completely into the booth, heavily keeping my hands safely under the table, entirely clutching my cheap purse where the massive high-fidelity recorder was entirely already rolling. "Please, Garrett," I completely whispered, entirely keeping my head heavily down. I aggressively read the massive document. "This legally says I entirely knowingly defrauded the government. If I entirely sign this, I could absolutely go to federal prison." He violently rolled his entirely fake eyes, aggressively pushing a cheap pen heavily toward me. "You absolutely won't completely go to federal prison, Arya. You are entirely a first-time offender heavily with a perfectly clean legal record and a massive sob story entirely about a fake disability. The judge will absolutely give you easy probation. But if I entirely take the massive fall, I heavily lose my real estate license. I entirely lose the massive firm. I completely lose absolutely everything. And if I lose absolutely everything, I will aggressively make entirely sure the world absolutely knows entirely about your pathetic phantom abortion. Do you entirely want your mother to completely hear that massive lie? Do you entirely want your pathetic church friends to heavily hear it?" I entirely let a highly single, fake tear actively slide heavily down my cheek. It was a massive act entirely worthy of an Academy Award. "But Garrett, surely the aggressive IRS will entirely check the legal signatures heavily on the massive transfer documents. They will completely see it absolutely wasn't me." He actively leaned incredibly close, his massive arrogance completely making him incredibly careless. He aggressively lowered his entirely smug voice, but he completely spoke incredibly clearly directly into the highly hidden microphone entirely in my bag. "Don't be totally stupid. They entirely won't completely know the exact difference because I am the exact one entirely who actively signed them. Just exactly like I entirely signed your name aggressively on the refinance papers heavily for the massive house. Just completely like I intensely forged your signature entirely on the closing documents completely for the Henderson account 3 exact years ago. I have completely been entirely perfecting your exact signature since our highly cheap honeymoon. Arya, I completely own your exact name entirely better than you absolutely do." My massive heart actively hammered heavily in my chest. There it entirely was. Not completely just massive tax fraud, but an entire admission heavily of long years of intense forgery and aggressive identity theft. He had entirely just completely confessed heavily to multiple massive felonies, simply to violently comfort his pathetic victim. I actively picked up the cheap pen, my hand violently trembling, absolutely not from intense fear, but entirely from the sheer massive adrenaline of the complete kill. "So, you completely did it entirely all?" I asked heavily, ensuring the exact audio would be completely crystal clear. "You actively forged absolutely everything, every single massive document," he aggressively scoffed. "Now, entirely sign the massive affidavit and actively save us completely both the intense trouble." I actively scribbled a massive signature entirely on the heavy paper. It completely wasn't my entirely real signature. It was a completely jagged, massive mess that absolutely any forensic handwriting expert would heavily verify was completely done entirely under intense duress. Garrett aggressively snatched the heavy paper, actively blowing entirely on the wet ink. "See, was that entirely so completely hard?" He violently stood up, aggressively buttoning his expensive coat, heavily looking completely down at me entirely with intense pity. "You entirely did the absolutely right thing, Arya. Actively keep your entirely pathetic mouth shut, and I will completely forget you actively exist." He aggressively walked entirely out of the cheap diner, actively strutting exactly like a highly pathetic peacock. He genuinely entirely thought he had completely just heavily secured his intense freedom. He had absolutely no idea he had entirely just heavily spoken his exact own massive prison sentence entirely into active existence. I heavily waited completely, until his massive car entirely pulled completely away entirely. Before I actively pulled out the massive recorder and heavily pressed exactly stop, I absolutely didn't completely just actively have massive leverage anymore. I completely had a massive confession. I heavily ordered a massive slice of entirely cherry pie and heavily ate it completely slowly, entirely savoring every exact single bite. The massive game was entirely rigged, and he had completely just actively played his exact final, entirely losing hand. I heavily sat entirely at my massive desk, completely holding the exact final piece of the massive puzzle. It was an entirely square envelope actively made of heavy matte black entirely paper heavily, with the exact sterling crest entirely embossed in absolute real gold. To the entirely untrained exact eye, it was completely just a massive invitation entirely to the most incredibly exclusive active social event of the entire year. To entirely me, it was a massive summons directly to an entire execution. I aggressively ran my thumb completely over the raised lettering entirely one exact last time before actively sealing it. I completely didn't entirely trust the active mail system entirely with this. I heavily handed it exactly to my entirely personal elite driver heavily with strict, intense instructions. Hand deliver entirely this completely to the exact penthouse and absolutely make entirely sure they actively sign completely for it. Across the massive city, Garrett was entirely likely completely still actively congratulating himself entirely on his massive performance entirely at the cheap diner. He entirely probably completely thought he had actively successfully bullied his entirely weak ex-wife entirely into massive submission. He had absolutely no entirely idea completely that entirely while he was actively drinking his entirely victory scotch, a heavily paid courier was actively riding completely up the luxury elevator to entirely deliver his absolute doom. When the exact doorbell entirely rang at the massive penthouse, Jessica heavily answered completely it. She was entirely in a highly foul mood, entirely still heavily recovering completely from the massive humiliation at the luxury boutique. She aggressively snatched the heavy clipboard entirely from the driver, actively signing her name heavily with an intensely angry scrawl. But entirely when she completely saw the massive package, her entire mood violently shifted entirely instantly. It completely wasn't an aggressive bill. It absolutely wasn't a massive lawsuit. It was an entirely velvet box heavily tied completely with a luxury silk ribbon. She aggressively carried it entirely into the massive living room completely where Garrett was actively pacing nervously, heavily checking his phone entirely for loan updates. "Babe, entirely look exactly at this," she stated loudly, her voice intensely trembling heavily with massive excitement. "It entirely has the massive sterling official seal." She actively pulled the exact ribbon and entirely opened the massive box. Completely inside, heavily nestled on a massive bed of pure white satin, lay two entirely thick, heavy cards heavily etched in entirely pure silver. The Sterling Luxury Group Annual Charity Gala. Admit to VIP access. And completely there was a highly handwritten, active note entirely attached, looking entirely forward completely to finally meeting exactly the massive face of our brand. Jessica entirely screamed. It absolutely wasn't a massive scream of entire fear, exactly like the one she would completely let entirely out later. This was a highly intense scream of pure, completely unadulterated massive vanity. She aggressively jumped completely up and exactly down, actively clutching the massive invitation heavily to her chest entirely like a pathetic teenager entirely who completely just got massive backstage passes entirely to a concert. "Oh my entire God, Garrett." She shrieked loudly, violently spinning entirely around the massive room. "Do you entirely see this? The massive chairwoman exactly invited us entirely personally. She absolutely wants to completely meet exactly me. I entirely knew it. I absolutely knew she would completely love my massive online photos. The entire contract was absolutely just a massive formality. She completely probably actively wants to heavily promote me entirely to global ambassador." Garrett aggressively took the heavy card entirely from her, his manicured hands entirely shaking slightly. He absolutely didn't care entirely about the massive fashion or the entirely fake ambassador role. He strictly saw the massive guest list heavily printed entirely on the back. Mega CEOs, elite global investors, massive hedge fund managers. This was an entire room heavily filled completely with incredibly wealthy people entirely, who absolutely had enough massive money entirely to actively bail him completely out of his massive toxic debt, exactly 10 times over. If he could entirely just actively charm completely one of them, he could heavily survive. "This is absolutely it, Jess," he stated loudly, an intense look of entirely desperate massive hope entirely washing completely over his face. "This is our exact, absolute ticket heavily out of the massive hole. If we entirely play this completely right, we are absolutely entirely set completely for life." Jessica entirely wasn't completely actively listening entirely to him. She was absolutely already heavily mentally entirely spending massive money she absolutely entirely didn't have. "I actively need a massive dress," she aggressively declared, her entire eyes heavily wild. "Absolutely not completely just entirely any dress. I completely need exactly something entirely that actively says I absolutely entirely own the massive room. I entirely need something completely that heavily makes entirely every single exact other woman completely. They're absolutely look exactly like a pathetic peasant. I'm entirely going completely to absolutely be exactly the massive queen, entirely of the exact night, Garrett. Absolutely everyone is entirely going completely to absolutely be entirely looking exactly at me." She was entirely, absolutely right. Completely everyone would actively be entirely looking exactly at her, but they absolutely wouldn't entirely be completely looking heavily with massive envy. They would entirely be completely looking absolutely with sheer, unadulterated horror. I entirely watched completely, the active delivery confirmation heavily pop entirely up completely on my massive screen. The exact trap was entirely heavily set. The massive rats had completely entirely taken the exact cheese. Now completely all I entirely absolutely had completely to actively do was heavily entirely wait exactly for the massive snap. The exact digital notification entirely on my massive private server heavily blinked completely green, entirely indicating an absolute asset liquidation. I heavily leaned entirely forward completely in my massive leather chair, entirely watching the exact digital trail heavily of my terrible husband's entire massive desperation. It was entirely his expensive Rolex Daytona, the massive luxury watch he had entirely bought completely with his exact first highly massive commission heavily checks entire years ago. The exact massive watch he had entirely told completely me he would actively pass heavily down entirely to our entire future son completely one exact day. He had entirely just completely actively sold it entirely to a shady pawn shop heavily in the Diamond District, entirely for a pathetic fraction completely of its exact massive value. I entirely knew exactly entirely why completely he absolutely did it. The massive money entirely wasn't completely going actively toward the massive toxic mortgage or the entirely mounting heavy legal fees. It was entirely being completely actively funneled heavily, directly entirely, into an incredibly massive boutique entirely on Fifth Avenue. Jessica had absolutely decided entirely that if completely she was actively going entirely to meet the highly mysterious massive chairwoman completely of Sterling Holdings, she absolutely heavily needed entirely to completely look exactly like massive royalty. In entirely their luxury penthouse, the entire atmosphere was completely absolutely toxic. I could entirely easily completely imagine the exact massive scene perfectly. Jessica aggressively standing entirely in the massive middle of the entire room, heavily screaming completely that she absolutely had entirely nothing to heavily wear entirely, while Garrett actively tried completely to heavily explain entirely that they were absolutely technically completely insolvent. She would entirely have completely actively used her exact favorite massive weapon, emotional manipulation. She would entirely have heavily told completely him that this exact massive gala was entirely, their completely absolute only exact chance entirely to actively network completely with elite billionaires. She would entirely have aggressively argued completely that looking entirely poor was the absolutely quickest exact way entirely to completely stay totally poor. And entirely Garrett, heavily being the entirely weak massive man he completely was, entirely heavily crumbled. He actively sacrificed his entire absolutely last massive tangible exact asset entirely to heavily buy completely her a massive dress. It was an entirely custom massive gown, completely actively made heavily of spun pure gold thread entirely, and completely heavily encrusted exactly with massive crystals. The exact massive price tag entirely was a staggering $50,000. It was completely entirely obscene. It was an entire year's absolutely massive salary entirely, for a normal working person heavily spent completely on a massive piece of fabric entirely, that she would actively wear completely for exactly 4 hours. When they entirely walked completely heavily out entirely of the exact massive boutique, Jessica was entirely beaming completely brightly, actively clutching entirely the massive garment bag exactly like completely. It held entirely the exact massive secrets entirely to the entire universe. She genuinely entirely believed completely that this exact massive dress was entirely her absolute armor. She entirely thought exactly that completely if she actively shone heavily bright entirely enough, absolutely no one entirely would completely actively see the exact massive rot entirely underneath. She heavily spent completely the entire absolutely rest exactly of the massive day entirely in a heavy frenzy completely of intense preparation entirely, actively booking massive elite makeup artists and completely expensive hairstylists entirely on exact credit cards that completely were absolute moments entirely away completely from actively being entirely declined. Garrett, however, was absolutely entirely not completely smiling. The exact massive surveillance entirely footage completely from the absolute lobby of their massive building entirely showed completely him highly looking entirely pale and intensely sweaty. He absolutely entirely wasn't completely going exactly to this massive party entirely to heavily celebrate. He was entirely going completely on a massive entirely desperate hunting expedition. In his entirely delusional massive mind, this exact gala was entirely his absolute lifeline. He completely believed entirely that exactly if he entirely could completely absolutely just actively get entirely into that massive room, he completely could heavily charm a massive venture capitalist entirely, or a heavy investor. He entirely thought completely he could actively pitch entirely his heavily failing exact real estate completely ideas entirely over expensive cocktails completely, and actively secure an entire massive check that completely would heavily wipe entirely away his exact massive debt. He was entirely rehearsing completely his fake lines entirely in the massive mirror, completely practicing entirely his firm handshake, entirely trying completely to actively mask the absolute heavy scent of entire fear, entirely, that completely actively clung heavily to him. He entirely told completely himself entirely that exactly one massive handshake completely would entirely fix absolutely everything. He entirely had absolutely no exact idea completely that there were absolutely entirely no exact investors completely waiting entirely for completely him at the massive Plaza Hotel. There was entirely absolutely no exact massive salvation. There was entirely completely only exact me. I entirely closed completely the massive laptop and heavily stood completely entirely up, actively walking entirely to the exact massive full length, completely mirror entirely in my massive office. My exact own massive dress entirely hung completely heavily on an expensive mannequin entirely in the exact corner. It was entirely a highly elegant, completely understated massive midnight entirely blue custom silk. It absolutely entirely didn't completely actively scream heavily for massive attention entirely, because it absolutely completely didn't entirely have completely to. I entirely ran completely my massive hand heavily over the expensive exact silk, entirely knowing completely that exact tonight absolutely entirely wasn't completely just a massive party. It was entirely an absolute massive courtroom. The entirely exact dress was completely the massive judge's heavy robe. The entirely massive ballroom completely was the exact dock, and the absolutely entire massive verdict entirely had completely absolutely already entirely been heavily written. I entirely checked completely the exact massive time. Exactly entirely 2 completely massive hours entirely, until exact showtime. Entirely 2 completely massive exact hours entirely, until Garrett completely heavily realized entirely that he completely had actively sold entirely his massive watch to heavily buy an entire exact ticket completely to his absolutely own entirely massive funeral. The massive Plaza Hotel entirely was heavily besieged completely by an entire massive storm entirely of aggressive camera flashes, entirely turning completely the exact massive night entirely into an absolute blinding heavy strobe effect. To the entirely naked complete eye, it entirely was a massive celebration absolutely of entire unimaginable complete wealth. Entirely, but to absolutely me, completely actively watching entirely from the heavily secure massive monitors, entirely inside the exact control room. It completely entirely looked exactly like a massive slaughterhouse, and entirely the absolute cattle completely had entirely just heavily arrived. An entirely hired, completely massive black exact limousine, entirely pulled completely heavily up entirely to the exact massive curb, entirely, and the complete heavy door entirely swung completely actively open. Jessica entirely merged completely absolutely first. The massive $50,000 exact dress entirely did its completely massive job. She entirely actively shimmered completely heavily under the massive bright lights exactly like an entire human disco ball. Entirely, the massive crystals completely actively catching entirely every single photon and heavily refracting entirely. It completely into a massive desperate exact plea entirely for absolute complete attention. She absolutely entirely didn't completely actively walk. She entirely heavily prowled, completely posing aggressively entirely for the massive paparazzi completely with the entire absolute hunger, entirely of a massive exact woman completely, who entirely genuinely believed completely absolute fake fame, entirely, was an entire substitute completely for actual financial solvency. Garrett entirely followed completely absolutely her, actively smoothing entirely the expensive lapels completely of his massive heavy tuxedo. On entire exact camera, he completely entirely looked absolutely massive and heavily dashing. The entirely exact picture completely of a massive young entire titan of exact industry. But entirely I had completely the massive exact camera feed actively zoomed entirely in heavily to maximum high resolution. I entirely could completely absolutely easily actively see entirely the massive exact tightness, entirely completely, in his heavily clenching jaw. I entirely could completely absolutely see the exact massive way his entirely terrified eyes heavily darted completely entirely around. Absolutely entirely not completely looking entirely for massive adoring fans. Completely but heavily scanning entirely. The massive exact crowd completely entirely for legal process servers completely or massive angry creditors. He aggressively gripped entirely Jessica's completely tiny waist far too heavily entirely tightly. His exact massive knuckles absolutely entirely white. Exactly entirely like a completely massive drowning absolute man, entirely desperately holding completely entirely onto a massive exact piece, entirely of completely actively burning entire driftwood. They entirely actively made completely their massive exact way entirely down the absolutely entire massive crimson red rug, completely stopping entirely heavily at the exact massive main press completely pit. A massive entirely aggressive reporter completely from a major entire massive gossip exact channel, entirely actively thrust entirely a massive heavy microphone completely heavily toward entirely absolutely them. Jessica, Garrett, entirely over exactly completely here. You entirely too absolutely look completely massive and heavily incredible entirely exactly tonight. But we entirely absolutely have completely entirely to actively ask. There entirely have completely absolutely been massive entirely rumors completely heavily swirling entirely exactly about a completely massive messy, split entirely heavily with your exact absolute former entire wife, Garrett. Some massive entirely sources completely actively say she entirely was completely absolutely left entirely destitute completely heavily after a massive entire tragic exactly accident. Is entirely, there completely absolutely any exact massive truth entirely completely to that? I entirely heavily leaned completely exactly forward, entirely completely in my massive heavy chair, entirely in the absolutely complete control exact room. This entirely was exactly the massive absolute moment. They entirely could completely absolutely have entirely actively heavily declined completely to entirely completely comment. They entirely could completely absolutely have heavily entirely shown exactly a massive complete shred, entirely of entirely absolute human dignity. But entirely Jessica completely actively grabbed entirely the massive exact heavy microphone completely heavily as exactly if it entirely absolutely were entirely a massive royal scepter. She entirely tilted completely her massive empty head, entirely heavily actively adopting entirely that absolutely exact sickeningly entire sweet massive fake expression, entirely. She completely heavily used exactly for entirely her absolutely pathetic entire apology completely massive videos. Oh, it absolutely entirely completely heavily breaks my massive entire exact heart completely, that entirely absolutely terrible people completely are entirely heavily actively spreading such massive entirely complete exact lies. She entirely sighed completely heavily, entirely actively batting completely her massive exact fake, entirely false absolute eyelashes. The entire absolute completely exact massive truth entirely is Garrett's completely massive absolute entire ex-wife. Well, Arya is an entirely completely massive absolutely troubled exact heavy woman. We entirely didn't completely absolutely heavily want to actively make entirely it exactly completely massive public, but she entirely has completely absolutely struggled entirely heavily with massive entire severe completely absolute mental exactly instability, completely for entire heavy years. The massive entire absolute accident entirely was completely heavily just entirely an exact result completely of exactly one entirely completely massive absolute of her entire episodes. The massive entire exact reporter completely heavily pressed entirely actively on, entirely completely sensing absolute massive blood. So she entirely wasn't completely absolutely exact heavily abandoned. Abandoned? Jessica entirely gasped completely heavily, entirely actively clutching completely her massive expensive exact chest. Heavens, absolutely entirely no. We entirely are completely absolute massive family entirely in a completely exact heavily way. Garrett and I entirely still completely absolute heavily actively pay entirely completely for her massive entire exact absolute housing. We entirely send completely heavy massive exact monthly entire checks entirely completely for her absolute massive medication exactly and entire completely heavy therapy. It entirely is completely a massive absolute heavy entire burden entirely financially completely and actively exactly emotionally. But we entirely could completely absolutely never exactly heavily just actively turn entirely our complete massive back exactly entirely on completely absolutely someone entirely so massive and completely entirely helpless. We entirely absolutely just actively completely want her entirely to completely absolute heavily get better exactly entirely far complete massive away entirely from completely the massive absolute exact heavy pressures completely of an entirely active massive entire life she entirely absolutely couldn't completely heavily entirely handle. Garrett entirely nodded completely absolute heavily solemnly entirely beside her, completely actively playing his massive entire exact absolute part entirely completely in the massive entire heavy charade. We entirely completely absolute heavily pray entirely for her massive entire completely exact absolute recovery entirely every single heavy complete massive day. He entirely added completely actively, his entire massive absolute exact voice entirely dripping completely heavily with massive entire faux absolutely complete sincerity. But entirely tonight is completely absolute heavily exactly about entirely actively moving completely massive absolute forward. It entirely is completely heavily about absolutely entirely actively celebrating massive completely exact absolute success entirely and completely Those absolutely entire massive, exactly, who entirely have completely the heavy absolute entire strength, entirely completely, to actively achieve it. I entirely watched completely absolutely them, entirely actively heavily bask, completely entirely, in the absolute massive exact entire approval, completely of the entirely heavy absolute press. Entirely completely actively accepting massive entire absolute praise, completely for entirely heavy exact absolutely charity. They entirely completely never absolute heavily gave entirely, for a completely massive entire exact woman. They entirely completely absolutely tried to entirely actively destroy. Jessica entirely flashed completely one absolute heavy massive exact final, entirely completely winning absolute fake massive smile. Entirely turning completely heavily to actively whisper entirely, something completely exactly in Garrett's massive absolute entire ear entirely, that completely heavily looked exactly entirely like, I absolutely entirely nailed it. You entirely certainly completely absolute heavily exactly did. I entirely whispered completely softly exactly to the massive absolute entire screen. My completely massive exact absolute entire finger, entirely hovering completely actively heavily over the absolute entirely exact button, entirely completely, that would actively queue up the entirely massive, absolutely next entirely heavy exact massive phase, completely of entirely their absolutely entire nightmare. They entirely completely absolute actively turned entirely, and completely heavily walked, entirely exactly up the massive entire absolutely complete stairs, entirely completely toward the absolute massive heavy, exact entirely ballroom doors. Entirely completely oblivious absolutely entirely heavily, to the exact massive entire, completely absolute fact, entirely. That completely they absolutely were entirely actively completely heavily walking entirely straight exactly into the massive entire absolute lion's complete den. And I entirely was completely the absolute heavy exact massive one entirely actively holding exactly the complete master entire key. The entire grand massive absolutely complete ballroom entirely of completely. The absolute heavily exact plaza entirely had completely absolute heavily been entirely actively transformed entirely into exactly a massive complete entire palace heavily F pure gold entirely and completely absolute exact velvet. Massive entirely absolute complete crystal, chandeliers the exactly entire complete heavy massive size entirely of completely absolute exact entirely small cars, entirely actively hung completely entirely heavily from the exactly absolute massive complete ceiling. Entirely actively casting completely an exact massive absolute warm entire amber, completely glow heavily entirely over the exactly entire complete massive room. The entirely complete absolute heavy air entirely absolutely didn't completely actively exact smell entirely heavily like entirely cheap massive perfume or completely absolute food. It entirely completely heavily smelled exactly absolute massive like entirely complete absolute old entire heavy money. It entirely smelled completely heavily exactly absolute like entire completely massive active generations, entirely completely of accumulated exact absolute heavy entire power, entirely, that absolutely completely didn't actively need entirely to completely exact, raise its massive heavy absolute voice entirely completely to be heavily heard. When entirely Garrett completely and absolute heavy massive exact Jessica entirely stepped completely actively heavily through the entire completely massive absolute oak doors. Entirely, they completely absolute heavily stopped exactly entirely dead completely entirely in their absolute massive exact tracks. For the entirely absolute completely exact heavy massive first entire time completely all exactly absolute heavy night. The entire massive absolute completely exact arrogance, entirely heavily drained completely entirely from their exact absolute massive faces. Entirely completely heavily replaced absolutely by the entire completely exact massive terrifying realization, entirely completely, of what absolutely massive exact true entire power heavily looked entirely completely like. They entirely were completely absolute, heavily exact, used entirely, to actively completely being the entire massive exact absolute big fish, entirely completely in the heavy absolutely exact small massive pond, entirely of complete entire pathetic Instagram, entirely absolute completely exact influencers, entirely, and completely heavy massive absolute mid-level entire exact real estate brokers. But entirely here, completely absolutely heavily in this exactly massive entire absolute complete ocean. They entirely were completely actively absolutely barely entirely heavy exactly massive plankton. To entirely, their complete absolute exact massive left, entirely stood completely an absolute entire heavy massive tech mogul, entirely, who completely absolute exactly actively, had just entirely completely heavily privatized exact massive entire space absolute travel. To entirely completely, their absolutely exact heavy right, an entire massive completely absolute European duchess, entirely, was completely actively heavily laughing entirely softly completely, while actively entirely adjusting exactly, a completely massive absolute entire heavy tiara, that entirely had completely absolute exactly heavily survived 3 entire absolute massive revolutions. The entirely complete absolutely exact room was entirely an absolute heavy massive sea entirely of completely exact absolutely active bespoke massive, tuxedos entirely, and completely absolutely heavy exact entire haute couture massive, entirely gowns, that entirely completely heavily absolutely made Jessica's entire $50,000 exact massive absolutely complete dress entirely look completely exactly like an absolutely entire heavily cheap massive costume entirely completely from a high exactly absolute massive entire school heavily active play. Garrett entirely swallowed completely absolute heavily exact hard, actively tugging entirely completely at his massive entire absolutely complete heavy collar. His entirely complete absolutely exact massive eyes entirely darted completely actively heavily around the entire absolute completely massive exact room entirely completely with highly frantic absolute entire massive desperation. He entirely absolutely completely wasn't heavily actively entirely looking at the exact absolute massive complete beauty. He entirely was completely absolute, heavily actively looking entirely exactly at the absolute entire massive complete wallets. He entirely spotted completely an exact absolute massive entire heavy venture, completely entirely capitalist. He absolutely had heavily entirely been actively exactly attempting completely to email entirely heavily for entire absolute complete months, entirely standing completely exactly near the massive entire absolute heavy ice completely exact sculpture. Stay entirely cool, Garrett completely whispered entirely heavily actively to exactly Jessica. Entirely completely, although absolutely, he was entirely heavily exactly actively sweating entirely completely through his entire absolute massive complete heavy shirt. Just entirely. Actively completely smile. We entirely belong completely exactly absolutely heavily here. We entirely are completely exactly the absolute heavy massive Vances. They entirely tried completely actively absolute to mingle. They entirely attempted completely absolutely exactly heavily to insert completely entirely themselves exactly entirely into absolute massive heavy conversations. Entirely completely. But the absolutely exact entire massive elite entirely have completely an absolute heavy exact massive active sixth. Entirely completely sense entirely for absolute complete desperate entirely heavy massive failure. Every entirely single complete absolute exactly massive time, entirely Garrett heavily actively approached completely, a massive absolute entire exact group, entirely heavily holding, completely absolute exactly actively out his entire massive, heavy exact hand, entirely completely, with that absolutely entire massive, exact completely practiced heavy fake absolute salesman, entirely complete grin. The entirely massive absolute exact complete heavily active circle entirely would completely absolute exactly tight. Entire massive absolute backs entirely would completely absolute actively turn. Entirely heavy, massive, completely exact, absolute conversations, entirely. Would completely, heavily, exactly, entirely switch completely, absolute, actively into French entirely or Italian. They entirely were completely, absolutely, actively, heavily, being entirely exact, completely, absolutely frozen, entire out, entirely, completely, in plain, exact, absolute, massive, heavy sight. Finally, an entirely, completely, absolutely exact, active, tuxedoed mater D. Entirely, heavily, entirely approached, completely, absolute, them entirely holding completely, a massive, absolutely exact, heavy, entire seating chart, entirely, completely bound, actively, heavily, in absolute, complete, entire, exact leather. Mr. Entirely and Mrs. Completely, absolute, exact, massive Vance. He entirely stated completely, absolutely, heavily, exactly. His entire, massive, completely, absolute voice, entirely devoid, completely, absolute, heavily, exactly of entirely all absolute emotion. Please entirely, completely, absolutely, heavily follow exactly me to entirely, completely your absolute, exact, massive table. Jessica entirely perked, completely, absolute, heavily, exactly up, actively, heavily, entirely adjusting completely her absolute, entire, massive crystals. Finally, she entirely hissed, completely, absolute, heavily, exactly, to entirely complete Garrett. They entirely, probably, completely, absolutely, heavily, exactly, actively saved entirely us, the completely, absolute, entire, massive, exact, heavy head table. Entirely, completely, exactly, next, absolutely, entirely, to completely the massive, absolute, entire, exact, heavy chairwoman. They entirely, completely, absolutely followed the exact, massive, entire, active mater D. Entirely, completely past the absolute, heavy, massive, exact stage, entirely, where completely the entire, absolutely active orchestra entirely played. They entirely walked completely, absolute, heavily, exactly, actively, past the entire, massive, completely, absolute prime tables, entirely, completely, in the heavily, exact, massive, absolute center, entirely of completely the room. They entirely, completely, absolutely, heavily, exact, kept entirely, actively, completely walking. They entirely, absolutely, completely, heavily, exactly, entirely past completely the absolute, massive, heavy, entire, second tier, exactly tables. They entirely, completely, absolute, actively, heavily past exactly the massive, entire, absolute media pit. The entirely massive, complete, absolutely exact mater D. Entirely, absolutely, didn't completely, actively, heavy, exact, entirely stop completely. Until entirely they completely, absolutely, exactly, heavily reached entirely. The complete, absolute, massive, exact, very back entirely, completely of the entire heavy, absolute room. Entirely, exactly, completely right, absolute, heavily next entirely, to completely, the entire, absolutely, exact, swinging, massive, heavy double, entirely, completely doors of absolutely, the exact, entire, massive kitchen, entirely, completely, and the absolute, heavy, massive, exact, active entrance, entirely, completely to the entire, absolutely, exact, massive restrooms. Here entirely you completely, absolutely, heavily, exact are. Table 42. The entirely massive, absolute, completely exact mater D. Entirely said completely heavily. Actively gesturing entirely exactly to absolutely a completely massive, entire small, heavy, absolutely wobbly, entirely completely exact table. That entirely was completely, absolutely, heavily, practically entirely, in the exact, complete, entire, massive dark. The entirely complete, absolutely exact, heavy smell entirely of completely absolute massive dish, entirely soap, and completely heavily absolute exact active sanitizer, entirely drifted completely absolute heavily from the exactly entire massive complete kitchen, entirely completely doors, absolute heavily actively mixed with entirely completely entire absolutely massive exact heavy traffic, entirely completely of busy entirely absolute waiters, completely heavily exactly scraping massive entirely complete plates. Jessica entirely stared completely absolute heavily exactly at the entire massive absolute complete table, entirely completely in horror. Her entirely complete absolutely exact heavy face, entirely turned completely an absolutely massive entire violent shade completely of red. Excuse entirely completely absolutely exactly me. She entirely snapped completely absolute heavily. Her entire massive absolutely exact voice entirely shrill completely heavily exactly enough entirely to absolutely completely actively make the entire massive complete exact guests at entirely table 40 one completely actively absolute entirely turn completely around. Their entirely must completely absolutely heavily be a massive entire exact absolute mistake. Do entirely, you completely absolutely exactly heavily know exactly who entirely completely I am. I entirely am completely absolute heavily, the exact massive entire face entirely of completely Lumiere. I entirely am completely absolute heavily, the exact massive entire active guest of honor. You entirely cannot completely absolute heavily exactly put entirely completely, me absolute heavily exactly, by the completely entire massive toilet. The entirely massive complete, absolutely exact mater D. Entirely looked completely absolute heavily at her exactly entirely, with the completely absolute same exact entire heavy massive expression entirely completely. One would actively absolute heavily exact entirely, give a completely entirely noisy massive absolute fly. I entirely assure completely absolutely exactly heavily you, madam. There entirely is completely absolutely no massive entire exact heavy mistake. The entirely complete absolute heavily exact seating entirely chart was completely absolute actively heavily approved entirely completely personally entirely by exactly the massive entire absolute completely heavy chairwoman. She entirely completely absolutely heavily exact felt entirely completely. This exact absolute massive location entirely was completely absolute heavily actively entirely appropriate completely for exactly entirely your absolute entire massive standing. Jessica entirely gasped completely absolute heavily, actively entirely looking completely absolute heavily exactly around to entirely see completely absolute exactly. If entirely absolutely anyone was completely actively heavy exact watching entirely her massive absolute complete entire humiliation. Garrett entirely actively completely heavily grabbed her entire absolutely massive exact arm, entirely pulling completely absolutely heavily.